The Necrontyr homeworld existed as a testament to biological cruelty on a cosmic scale. The planet circled a star that bathed its surface in relentless, cancer-inducing radiation. Every living thing that evolved under that poison light bore the consequences in their flesh and genes. The Necrontyr themselves emerged from this crucible as a species defined by suffering. Their bodies developed with an inherent fragility, cells dividing and mutating with alarming frequency. Tumors grew in their organs before they reached maturity. Their skin withered and cracked under the constant bombardment of their sun's malevolent rays. Life expectancy rarely exceeded a handful of decades, and those years were marked by progressive deterioration and pain. The radiation didn't discriminate. Every Necrontyr, from the moment of birth, carried the certainty of a premature, agonizing death. Children watched their parents succumb to spreading cancers. Adults felt their bodies betray them in their prime years. The elderly were virtually non-existent. This wasn't the natural cycle of life and death that other species experienced across the galaxy. This was systematic torture inflicted by the very star that should have given them life. The Necrontyr looked up at their sun not with gratitude but with hatred, seeing it as a malicious entity that had cursed them to brief, tormented existences. Despite these overwhelming biological handicaps, the Necrontyr refused to simply accept extinction. Their civilization developed with a fierce determination born from the knowledge that time was never on their side. They built cities of dark stone and metal, structures designed to endure long after their creators had turned to dust. Their architecture reflected their obsession with permanence. Massive tombs and monuments dominated their urban landscapes, each one a desperate attempt to achieve through construction what their bodies could never provide: lasting existence. The buildings stood as silent accusations against the universe that had dealt them such a cruel hand. Necrontyr society organized itself into a rigid hierarchical structure dominated by dynastic noble families. These dynasties controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of billions. The nobles obsessed over bloodlines and succession, though their short lifespans made generational planning a frantic affair. A dynasty's patriarch might see his great-grandchildren reach adulthood before his own death, compressing what other species experienced over centuries into mere decades. This accelerated generational turnover created a culture where legacy became paramount. Every Necrontyr noble sought to leave an indelible mark, to be remembered when their cancer-riddled flesh finally failed. The lower castes served the dynasties with varying degrees of autonomy. Artisans, warriors, administrators, and laborers all knew their places in the social order. The system remained remarkably stable despite the biological crisis affecting every individual. Perhaps the universal nature of their suffering created a strange equality. When everyone faced the same agonizing fate, social position became one of the few meaningful distinctions. The dynasties maintained their authority through a combination of military force, technological control, and the promise that they would find a solution to the radiation curse. That promise, however hollow it might have been, kept the civilization functioning. Necrontyr technology advanced at a remarkable pace. Their scientists and engineers worked with the urgency of the condemned, knowing they had only years to make contributions that might take other species decades to achieve. They developed sophisticated medical techniques to manage the constant wave of cancers, though these treatments only delayed the inevitable. Their metallurgy reached impressive heights as they sought materials that could shield against radiation or preserve their bodies after death. Energy weapons, faster-than-light communication systems, and advanced computational devices all emerged from their desperate innovation. The Necrontyr became masters of technology not through patient research, but through the frantic efforts of millions of dying scientists racing against their own cellular decay. Death permeated every aspect of Necrontyr culture. Their art depicted skeletal figures and decay. Their literature dwelt on themes of mortality, legacy, and the injustice of their cursed existence. Philosophical schools debated the nature of consciousness and whether something of the self could persist beyond physical death. Religious movements arose promising various forms of afterlife or transcendence, though none could offer proof of their claims. The Necrontyr developed elaborate funeral rites that could last for days, transforming death from a private tragedy into a public ceremony of remembrance. They built necropolises that dwarfed their living cities, creating vast underground complexes where the dead outnumbered the living by orders of magnitude. This cultural fixation on death and immortality wasn't mere morbidity. It represented a rational response to their circumstances. When life offered only suffering and brevity, the Necrontyr sought meaning in what they left behind. A warrior's glory in battle, a craftsman's enduring creation, a ruler's lasting dynasty, these became the true measures of a life's worth. The Necrontyr didn't fear death itself. They had lived with its certainty since childhood. They feared being forgotten, dying without leaving evidence they had existed at all. This terror of insignificance drove them to increasingly grandiose displays of power and achievement. As their civilization matured, the Necrontyr began expanding beyond their homeworld. They colonized other planets in their star system, hoping that distance from their cursed sun might alleviate their condition. These early colonies became testing grounds for a desperate hypothesis. Initial results seemed promising. Necrontyr born on worlds farther from the star showed marginally longer lifespans and lower cancer rates. The improvement was measurable but ultimately insufficient. The radiation damage had become encoded in their very genetics over millions of years of evolution. Moving to new worlds slowed their decline but couldn't stop it. The curse traveled with them in their cells. The colonies developed their own character while maintaining ties to the dynasties. Each world became another monument to Necrontyr determination, another attempt to overcome their biological limitations through sheer will and technological prowess. They terraformed hostile environments, built sealed cities on airless moons, and established mining operations in asteroid fields. The expansion provided resources and living space, but it couldn't provide what the Necrontyr truly sought: escape from their mortality. Every colony eventually filled with the same tombs and monuments that dominated the homeworld. Every colonial population faced the same progression of illness and early death. The Necrontyr eventually developed faster-than-light travel technology, opening the possibility of true interstellar colonization. This breakthrough ignited hope throughout their civilization. Perhaps on worlds orbiting different stars, under different stellar radiation, they might finally find relief from their suffering. Expedition fleets launched toward nearby star systems, carrying colonists willing to travel for years in suspended animation for the chance at longer lives. These missions represented the pinnacle of Necrontyr hope and technological achievement. The dynasties poured enormous resources into the colonization effort, seeing it as potentially their civilization's salvation. The interstellar colonies established contact with their parent civilization and reported their findings. The news devastated the Necrontyr. Even on worlds orbiting stable, healthy stars, their condition persisted. The genetic damage ran too deep. Their cells still mutated and failed. Their bodies still developed cancers and deteriorated prematurely. The curse wasn't tied to their specific sun. It was woven into the fundamental structure of their biology. Millions of years under that radiation-saturated star had transformed the Necrontyr into a species genetically programmed for brief, painful lives. No amount of distance or environmental change could undo that legacy. This revelation transformed the Necrontyr psyche from desperate hope to bitter rage. They had conquered their star system, developed technologies that allowed them to cross the vast distances between stars, and established colonies on dozens of worlds. Yet all their achievements couldn't grant them what even the simplest organisms on other worlds possessed: the potential for long, healthy lives. The injustice of it poisoned their culture. The dynasties grew more aggressive in their competition for resources and prestige. Military buildups accelerated as noble houses sought to secure their legacies through conquest rather than longevity. The Necrontyr looked outward at a galaxy full of longer-lived species and felt a corrosive envy that would shape their future actions in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The development of reliable, faster-than-light travel technology marked a turning point in Necrontyr civilization, though not the salvation they had desperately sought. Their engineers had perfected the stasis crypt systems during the initial interstellar colonization attempts, creating sophisticated suspension chambers that could preserve Necrontyr bodies during voyages lasting decades or even centuries. These crypts became essential infrastructure for their expansion, as even with FTL capabilities, the distances between viable colony worlds required extended travel times. The technology worked by slowing cellular processes to near stasis, ironically giving the Necrontyr during transit what they could never achieve in waking life, time without the constant progression of their genetic curse. The stasis crypts line the holds of massive colony ships, each vessel carrying thousands of suspended Necrontyr, along with the technological and material resources needed to establish functioning settlements. The ships themselves represented masterworks of Necrontyr engineering, constructed from alloys designed to withstand the stresses of warp translation and real space travel across interstellar voids. Navigation systems plotted courses between stars, avoiding the most dangerous regions of space while seeking worlds that matched specific criteria for colonization. The fleets departed from the Necrontyr core worlds in waves, each expedition claiming territory in the name of their sponsoring dynasty. The establishment of the first dynasty worlds followed a systematic pattern refined through the earlier, disappointing colonial efforts within their home system. Survey teams awakened first, assessing the target world's conditions and beginning initial construction. They built landing facilities, established perimeter defenses, and began the process of adapting the local environment to Necrontyr needs. Once basic infrastructure existed, the main colonist population emerged from stasis to find skeletal cities already taking shape. These settlements incorporated the architectural preferences that had developed on the homeworld: massive structures built to endure millennia, extensive underground complexes, and the inevitable necropolises that would house the dead. Each dynasty world became an extension of its founding dynasty's power and prestige. The pharaohs, the supreme rulers of each dynasty, maintained direct control over their core territories while delegating authority over distant colonies to subordinate nobles. This created a complex web of feudal relationships spanning light years. A pharaoh might rule directly over the homeworld and several nearby systems, while maintaining suzerainty over dozens of more distant colonies governed by lesser nobles who owed him allegiance. These subordinate rulers held titles like Nemesser, commanding authority over specific worlds or sectors, or overlord, controlling smaller territories or military forces. The structure of the Necrontyr Empire at its height resembled a collection of competing power blocks more than a unified state. The major dynasties each controlled vast territories, sometimes encompassing hundreds of worlds. They maintained their own military forces, conducted their own diplomatic relations with other dynasties, and pursued independent policies regarding expansion and resource exploitation. The Triarch, a council of the three most powerful pharaohs, nominally governed the entire empire, but their actual authority varied depending on the relative strength of the dynasties they represented. When the Triarch's member dynasties agreed on policy, their combined power could enforce compliance across the empire. When they disagreed, the empire fractured into competing factions pursuing contradictory agendas. The political relationships between dynasties ranged from formal alliances to barely restrained hostility. Marriage alliances between noble houses attempted to bridge dynastic divides, though the Necrontyr's short lifespans made such arrangements temporary at best. A carefully negotiated union between two dynasties might last only a generation before the death of key figures reshuffled the political landscape. Trade agreements, military pacts, and territorial arrangements required constant renegotiation as circumstances changed and new leaders took power. The rapid generational turnover that characterized Necrontyr society created a political environment of perpetual instability, where long-term planning was impossible and opportunism flourished. The dynasties competed for control of resource-rich systems, strategic locations along major trade routes, and worlds with particular scientific or cultural significance. Border disputes erupted regularly as expanding dynasties encountered each other's colonial efforts. These conflicts ranged from diplomatic protests and economic sanctions to outright military confrontation. The Necrontyr had developed formidable weapons technology, and their fleets clashed in void battles that left debris fields orbiting contested worlds. Ground forces equipped with advanced energy weapons fought over territory that neither side could truly hold indefinitely given their biological limitations. The wars consumed resources and lives, yet they continued because each dynasty believed that expansion and military success represented the only path to lasting glory. The persistent curse that had driven the Necrontyr to the stars followed them to every world they colonized. Initial hopes that new stellar environments might alleviate their condition had proven false during the first wave of expansion, but the Necrontyr continued to search for any marginal improvement. They established colonies around stars of different spectral types, on worlds with varying levels of background radiation, in systems with unusual magnetic fields or other environmental factors that might influence their cellular degradation. Scientific teams studied each colonial population, meticulously documenting cancer rates, lifespans, and patterns of genetic mutation. The data accumulated over generations painted a consistent, dispiriting picture. Necrontyr born on worlds orbiting stable yellow stars lived no longer than those born under their original cursed sun. Colonies established on low radiation worlds showed no improvement in cancer rates. Settlements in systems with unusual electromagnetic properties reported the same patterns of cellular breakdown and premature aging. The curse wasn't environmental, it was intrinsic. Millions of years of evolution under radiation-saturated conditions had encoded the Necrontyrs suffering into their genome at such a fundamental level that no change in external conditions could reverse it. This realization spread through Necrontyr society like a plague of despair. The empire they had built, spanning hundreds of star systems and encompassing billions of individuals, had been constructed on false hope. All their technological achievements, all their territorial expansion, all their grand monuments and cities, none of it brought them any closer to escaping their biological prison. A Necrontyr born on the most distant colony world, under the light of an alien star, still faced the same brief, pain-filled existence as their ancestors on the homeworld. The curse was portable, traveling in their cells to every corner of the galaxy they reached. The psychological impact of this revelation transformed Necrontyr culture in fundamental ways. The earlier desperate hope gave way to a bitter, consuming rage at the universe itself. They had done everything a species could do to escape their fate. They had conquered the challenges of interstellar travel, established a vast empire, and applied their considerable scientific capabilities to understanding their condition. Yet they remained trapped in bodies that betrayed them, cells that mutated and failed regardless of location or circumstance. The injustice of it became unbearable. Other species they encountered during their expansion lived for centuries, even millennia in some cases, while the Necrontyr withered and died within decades. This bitterness manifested in increasingly aggressive policies toward other species and toward rival dynasties. The Necrontyr had never been particularly peaceful, but their expansionism took on a darker character. Conquest became an end in itself, a way to strike back at a universe that had cursed them. If they couldn't have long lives, they would at least leave an indelible mark on the galaxy through the scope of their empire and the fear they inspired in other species. Military buildups accelerated across all major dynasties. Shipyards worked constantly to produce ever larger fleets. Weapons research focused on developing more devastating technologies, not for defense, but for the projection of overwhelming force. Internal conflicts between dynasties intensified as competition for resources and territory grew more desperate. The political structures that had maintained relative stability began to fracture under the weight of accumulated grievances and the pressure of a civilization coming to terms with its inescapable mortality. Border wars escalated into sustained campaigns of conquest as stronger dynasties sought to absorb the territories of weaker rivals. The Triarch's authority eroded as its member dynasties pursued contradictory agendas and refused to compromise on matters of territorial expansion or resource allocation. The lower castes bore the brunt of this increasing militarization and internal conflict. Conscription drained populations as dynasties raised ever larger armies to fight their wars of expansion and internecine rivalry. Factory workers labored to produce weapons and war materiel instead of goods that might improve quality of life. Agricultural worlds were stripped of resources to feed the military machine. The promise that the dynasties would find a solution to the radiation curse had proven empty, yet the social hierarchy remained intact through force and tradition. Resentment built among the lower castes, though it rarely manifested as open rebellion. The universal nature of their suffering created a fatalistic acceptance. What did it matter who ruled when everyone faced the same brief, agonizing existence? The Necrontyrs' interactions with other spacefaring species during this period revealed the depth of their bitterness. They encountered civilizations of beings who lived for centuries without the constant specter of cancer and cellular degradation. These meetings rarely resulted in peaceful coexistence. The Necrontyr viewed longer-lived species with a mixture of envy and hatred, seeing in them everything they had been denied. Diplomatic contacts quickly deteriorated into hostility. The Necrontyr made demands for territory and resources that no sovereign civilization could accept, then used the inevitable refusals as justification for military action. The wars of expansion during this period established patterns that would define Necrontyr military doctrine for the remainder of their biological existence. Their fleets struck with overwhelming force, seeking to achieve decisive victories before their own personnel succumbed to their physical limitations. Ground campaigns focused on rapid conquest and the establishment of control through superior technology rather than prolonged occupation. The Necrontyr excelled at void warfare, their ships equipped with weapons that could reduce enemy vessels to constituent atoms. Their ground forces utilized energy weapons and advanced armor that gave them significant advantages over most opponents, though sustained campaigns took a toll as their soldiers' health deteriorated even during active service. The dynasty worlds themselves became monuments to Necrontyr ambition and despair. Each major colony developed into a center of power, with massive cities housing billions and industrial complexes producing the materiel needed to sustain the empire's expansion. The architecture grew more grandiose with each generation, as if the Necrontyr sought to compensate for their brief lives through the scale of their constructions. Pyramids and obelisks dominated urban skylines, structures so massive they could be seen from orbit. Underground complexes extended for kilometers, housing both the living and the vast necropolises that held their dead. The dynasty worlds became physical manifestations of the Necrontyr's determination to achieve permanence through construction, even as their bodies remained as fragile as ever. The Necrontyr's expansion across the galaxy brought them into contact with numerous species, most of which proved technologically inferior and easily subjugated or displaced. Their fleets encountered primitive civilizations still bound to their home systems, pre-industrial societies unaware that other intelligences existed among the stars, and occasionally species that had achieved interstellar capability but lacked the military sophistication to resist Necrontyr aggression. None of these encounters fundamentally challenged the Necrontyr's understanding of their place in the cosmos. They remained convinced that despite their biological curse, their technological prowess and imperial ambition made them the galaxy's dominant force. This conviction shattered when their scout fleets detected evidence of a civilization that operated on a scale and with capabilities that dwarfed anything the Necrontyr had achieved. The first signs came from worlds that should have been prime candidates for colonization, but showed evidence of deliberate terraforming far beyond Necrontyr capabilities. Entire planetary ecosystems had been redesigned with a sophistication that suggested mastery over biological processes at the most fundamental level. Atmospheric compositions had been adjusted with precision, creating environments optimized for specific forms of life. The Necrontyr survey teams found worlds where evolution itself seemed to have been guided, producing ecosystems of impossible complexity and balance. These weren't the crude environmental modifications the Necrontyr performed on their colony worlds. This was biological engineering on a scale that suggested the architects understood life in ways the Necrontyr, focused as they were on combating their own cellular degradation, had never approached. Further investigation revealed more disturbing evidence. Some worlds bore traces of civilizations that had risen and fallen, but the archaeological evidence suggested these species had been deliberately created and placed on those worlds. The genetic patterns showed signs of intentional design rather than natural evolution. The Necrontyr scientists who studied these findings struggled to comprehend the implications. A species existed that could create other intelligent species, seeding worlds with life forms engineered for specific purposes or environments. The technological and biological knowledge required for such feats exceeded anything in the Necrontyr's considerable scientific database. The Necrontyr eventually detected the architects of these biological wonders through their use of a transportation network that defied conventional understanding of physics. This network, which would later be known as the Webway, consisted of tunnels through an alternate dimension that connected distant points in real space. The Old Ones, as the Necrontyr came to call this ancient species, traveled through these passages, bypassing the limitations of conventional faster-than-light travel. The network's sophistication suggested it had been constructed over millions of years, with access points scattered across the galaxy. The Necrontyr's own faster-than-light technology, which they had considered a pinnacle of achievement, seemed primitive by comparison. The Old Ones themselves appeared as beings of flesh and biological matter, but their mastery over their own forms set them apart from any species the Necrontyr had encountered. They could manipulate their own biology, extending their lifespans to spans measured in millennia or longer. Some appeared to have achieved functional immortality through their biotechnological prowess, their cells regenerating without the degradation that plagued lesser species. They possessed psychic abilities, manipulating the Imperium in ways that allowed them to perceive and influence reality beyond the purely physical. Their civilization had existed for millions of years, predating the Necrontyr Empire by epochs. They had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species, shaped the evolution of worlds across the galaxy, and accumulated knowledge that made them functionally godlike by the standards of younger races. The Necrontyr's initial reaction to discovering the Old Ones combined awe with desperate hope. Here, finally, was a species that possessed the biological mastery the Necrontyr had sought throughout their entire existence. The Old Ones had conquered mortality itself, achieving through their understanding of life what the Necrontyr had failed to accomplish through all their technological advancement. They could manipulate genetics with precision, redesigning organisms at will. They understood cellular processes at a level that allowed them to prevent or reverse the kind of degradation that defined Necrontyr existence. If any beings in the galaxy could cure the Necrontyr's curse, it would be the Old Ones. The Triarch convened emergency sessions to debate how to approach this discovery. The political divisions that had fractured the Necrontyr Empire temporarily receded as the dynasties recognized the magnitude of what contact with the Old Ones might mean. Diplomatic missions were prepared with unprecedented care, carrying gifts of Necrontyr technology and art, along with detailed documentation of their civilization's achievements. The ambassadors received instructions to present the Necrontyr as a sophisticated, accomplished species worthy of the Old Ones' attention and assistance. The dynasties hoped that by demonstrating their technological capabilities and cultural sophistication, they might convince the Old Ones to share their biological secrets. The diplomatic expeditions made contact with Old One outposts and settlements scattered across the galaxy. The Old Ones received the Necrontyr ambassadors with what appeared to be polite interest, though their true feelings remained difficult to discern. They examined the gifts and documentation the Necrontyr presented, asked questions about Necrontyr civilization and technology, and listened to the carefully prepared appeals for assistance. The ambassadors explained their species' plight in detail, describing the genetic curse that limited their lifespans and caused constant suffering. They spoke of generations of failed attempts to cure their condition through their own scientific efforts. They made clear that the Necrontyr sought the Old Ones' help not as supplicants, but as fellow intelligent beings deserving of the chance to escape their biological prison. The Old Ones' response, when it finally came, devastated the Necrontyr. They refused to provide the requested assistance. The reasons for this refusal remained unclear, filtered through layers of translation and cultural misunderstanding. Some Old One representatives suggested that the Necrontyr's condition was too deeply embedded in their genome to be corrected without essentially creating a new species. Others indicated that the knowledge required to perform such biological restructuring couldn't be safely shared with a species that lacked the necessary foundation of understanding. Still others hinted that the Old Ones saw something in the Necrontyrs' nature, some fundamental aspect of their psychology or culture, that made granting them extended lifespans inadvisable. The Necrontyr ambassadors pressed for clarification, seeking any opening that might lead to the Old Ones reconsidering their position. They offered to trade Necrontyr technology for biological knowledge, proposed joint research programs where Old One scientists could work directly on the Necrontyr genetic problem, and even suggested that individual Necrontyr could serve as test subjects for experimental treatments. The Old Ones declined all these proposals. Their refusals grew firmer as the Necrontyr's desperation became more apparent. The diplomatic missions returned to Necrontyr space, carrying the crushing news that the one species capable of curing their curse had chosen not to help them. The psychological impact of this rejection cannot be overstated. The Necrontyr had endured their condition for millions of years, building their civilization despite knowing that every individual faced a brief, painful existence. They had expanded across the galaxy, established an empire, and developed technologies that placed them among the most advanced species in real space. All of this had been accomplished while carrying the burden of their genetic curse. They had maintained hope that somewhere, somehow, a solution existed. The discovery of the Old Ones had transformed that abstract hope into concrete possibility. For a brief period, the Necrontyr had believed they might finally escape their suffering. The Old Ones' refusal destroyed that hope and replaced it with something far more corrosive. The Necrontyr looked at the Old Ones and saw beings who possessed everything they desperately needed but would never receive. The Old Ones lived for millennia, their bodies healthy and strong, free from the constant specter of cancer and cellular breakdown. They had mastered the biological sciences to such a degree that they could create entire species, yet they refused to use that knowledge to help a civilization crying out for salvation. They traveled through their webway network, observing the galaxy from their position of biological and technological superiority, seemingly indifferent to the suffering of shorter-lived species. The Necrontyr's envy manifested first as bitter resentment, then transformed into active hatred. They had approached the Old Ones as potential benefactors, even saviors, but the rejection forced them to see the ancient species in a different light. The Old Ones weren't benevolent elders guiding younger races toward enlightenment. They were hoarders of knowledge, beings who possessed the power to alleviate unimaginable suffering, but chose not to exercise it. The Necrontyr began to question whether the Old Ones' refusal stemmed from inability or unwillingness. If they truly couldn't help, why not share their knowledge and let the Necrontyr attempt to find solutions themselves? The conclusion many Necrontyr reached was that the Old Ones simply didn't want to help, that they preferred to maintain their position of superiority over younger species. This interpretation, whether accurate or not, poisoned any possibility of peaceful coexistence between the two civilizations. The Necrontyr dynasties, which had briefly united in hope when the Old Ones were discovered, now united in anger at their rejection. Political debates in the Triarch shifted from discussing how to convince the Old Ones to help them to debating how to respond to what they increasingly viewed as a deliberate insult. The more militant dynasties argued for military action, suggesting that if the Old Ones wouldn't share their knowledge willingly, the Necrontyr should take it by force. More cautious voices warned that the Old Ones' technological and psychic capabilities made them dangerous opponents, but these warnings carried less weight as the Necrontyr's rage intensified. The Necrontyr's perspective on their own achievements soured in light of the Old Ones' existence. Everything they had accomplished, all their technological marvels and imperial expansion, seemed insignificant when compared to a species that could manipulate life itself and travel through dimensions beyond normal space. The monuments and cities they had built to achieve permanence appeared pathetic when set against the Old Ones' millions of years of existence. The Necrontyr had believed themselves to be among the galaxy's elite civilizations, but the Old Ones revealed them as merely another short-lived species struggling against biological limitations they couldn't overcome. The contrast between the two species became a source of constant psychological torment for the Necrontyr. Every diplomatic contact with the Old Ones reminded them of what they lacked. The Old Ones' casual mastery of biological processes that the Necrontyr couldn't begin to replicate, their psychic abilities that allowed them to perceive dimensions of reality invisible to Necrontyr senses, their ancient knowledge accumulated over epochs, all of it served as a reminder of the Necrontyr's inadequacy. The Old Ones didn't even seem to recognize how their existence mocked the Necrontyr's suffering. They continued their work of seeding worlds and guiding the evolution of younger species, apparently unconcerned with the Necrontyr's growing resentment. The Necrontyr's hatred extended beyond the Old Ones themselves to encompass the younger species the Ancient Ones had created or guided. These client races enjoyed the Old Ones' favor and protection, receiving the kind of assistance the Necrontyr had been denied. Some of these species showed signs of psychic potential, abilities the Old Ones were apparently cultivating. The Necrontyr saw this as further evidence of the Old Ones' hypocrisy. They would expend effort nurturing primitive species, but refused to help an advanced civilization escape a genetic curse. The client races became targets for Necrontyr aggression, attacked not just for territorial expansion, but out of spite toward their Old One patrons. The transformation of the Necrontyr from a civilization seeking salvation to one consumed by hatred occurred gradually, but inexorably. Individual dynasties began conducting raids on Old One client worlds, testing the ancient species' willingness to defend their protectorates. These attacks met with Old One resistance, confirming that while they wouldn't help the Necrontyr, they would act to protect species they had chosen to nurture. The military confrontations remained limited initially, skirmishes rather than full-scale war, but they established a pattern of hostility that would shape the galaxy's future. The Necrontyr learned that the Old Ones, for all their biological and psychic mastery, could be fought and sometimes defeated in direct military confrontation. The Necrontyr's declaration of war against the Old Ones emerged from the Triarch councils after years of escalating tensions and increasingly violent border skirmishes. The Silent King, Zarek, had risen to supremacy over the Triarch through a combination of political maneuvering and military success during the internal conflicts that had plagued the Necrontyr Empire. He recognized what previous leaders had failed to grasp. The Necrontyr dynasties would tear themselves apart in internecine warfare unless their collective rage found an external focus. The Old Ones provided that focus. Their rejection of the Necrontyr's pleas for biological salvation, combined with their apparent willingness to nurture primitive species while ignoring an advanced civilization's suffering, created a grievance that transcended dynastic rivalries. Zarek's genius lay in transforming the Necrontyr's despair into unified purpose. He traveled to the core worlds of the major dynasties, presenting his case before the pharaohs who controlled vast territories and commanded billions of subjects. The arguments he made resonated with rulers who had spent their brief lives watching their empires fragment under the weight of internal competition. War against the Old Ones offered something no amount of territorial conquest among themselves could provide, a chance to strike back at the universe itself for the injustice of their existence. If they couldn't have the long lives the Old Ones possessed, they would at least tear down the civilization that had refused to help them. The dynasties that had fought each other for generations found common cause in their hatred of the ancient species. The unification occurred with remarkable speed once the decision for war solidified. Dynasty fleets that had been positioned along contested borders redeployed toward Old One territories. Forge worlds that had produced weapons for internecine conflicts redirected their output toward the coming war. The Necrontyr military machine, already formidable from generations of internal warfare, focused its full capacity on a single enemy for the first time in their history. Zarek assumed the title of Silent King, a position that granted him supreme authority over all Necrontyr forces during the prosecution of the war. The pharaohs retained control over their dynasty's internal affairs, but military matters fell under the Silent King's direct command. This arrangement preserved dynastic autonomy while creating the unified command structure necessary for coordinated military action. The initial Necrontyr offensive caught the Old Ones unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the assault. The ancient species had observed the Necrontyr's internal conflicts and apparently concluded that the younger race would remain focused on its own territorial disputes. The Old One's scattered settlements and research outposts found themselves facing Necron-tier battle fleets, equipped with weapons designed to overwhelm any defense through sheer destructive power. Necron-tier warships mounted energy weapons that could reduce matter to its constituent atoms, particle accelerators that fired streams of exotic matter at relativistic velocities, and gravitational manipulators that could tear apart enemy vessels through localized distortions in spacetime. The technological superiority the Necron-tier brought to bear in these early engagements manifested in battles that left Old One installations devastated. Necron-tier ground forces deployed with weapons that made conventional warfare obsolete. Their Gauss flayers stripped matter layer by layer at the molecular level, reducing targets to dust in seconds. Particle casters projected beams of energized particles that passed through most forms of shielding. Tesla weapons arced between multiple targets, each discharge capable of incapacitating or killing dozens of enemies. The Necron-tier had spent their entire existence as a spacefaring civilization, developing ever more efficient methods of destruction, and they applied that accumulated knowledge with calculated brutality. The Old Ones responded with capabilities the Necron-tier had no framework to counter effectively. Their psychic powers allowed them to perceive Necron-tier fleet movements before attacks materialized, to manipulate matter and energy through force of will, and to strike at Necron-tier warriors' minds directly. Old One defenders manifested psychic barriers that absorbed or deflected energy weapons fire, created localized temporal distortions that aged Necron-tier soldiers decades in moments, and projected psychic assaults that drove entire units insane. The Necron-tier discovered that their technological sophistication meant nothing against enemies who could reshape reality through psychic manipulation. The Old One's mastery of biological weapons proved equally devastating. They unleashed engineered plagues that targeted Necron-tier physiology specifically, diseases that accelerated the cellular degradation the species already suffered. Necron-tier soldiers found their bodies failing even faster than normal, cancers spreading through their organs in days rather than years. Some biological weapons rewrote genetic codes, transforming Necron-tier warriors into twisted parodies of their original forms. Others disrupted neural pathways, leaving victims conscious but unable to control their bodies. The Old Ones demonstrated that their refusal to cure the Necron-tier's genetic curse hadn't stemmed from inability, but choice. They understood Necron-tier biology well enough to weaponize it with horrifying efficiency. The webway gave the Old Ones a strategic mobility the Necron-tier couldn't match. While Necron-tier fleets required days or weeks to travel between star systems, even with their faster-than-light technology, Old One forces moved through the webway's dimensional tunnels, emerging from access points scattered across the galaxy. A Necron-tier invasion force might besiege an Old One stronghold, only to find it evacuated through webway portals, its defenders relocated to strike at Necron-tier colonies light years away. The Old Ones raided Necron-tier supply lines, attacked lightly defended worlds, and withdrew before reinforcements could arrive. They turned the Necron-tier's vast empire into a liability, forcing the younger species to defend thousands of worlds against enemies who could strike anywhere. The Necron-tier's fundamental disadvantage in the war became apparent as the conflict extended beyond the initial offensives. Their short lifespans prevented the accumulation of experienced military leadership. A Necron-tier commander might spend decades learning the art of war, developing tactical expertise through study and combat experience, only to die of cancer before reaching the peak of his capabilities. His replacement started with minimal experience, forced to learn lessons that had already been learned and forgotten dozens of times. The Old Ones, by contrast, possessed military leaders who had commanded forces for millennia, who had studied warfare across epochs, and refined their understanding through centuries of practice. This experience gap manifested in countless engagements where Necron-tier technological superiority failed to overcome Old One strategic sophistication. Necron-tier fleets fell into ambushes that exploited predictable tactical patterns. Ground forces advanced into kill zones prepared by enemies who understood how the Necron-tier would deploy based on observations spanning generations. The Old Ones adapted to Necron-tier weapons and tactics, developing countermeasures that negated the younger species' advantages, while the Necrontyr struggled to counter psychic abilities and webway mobility that defied their understanding of physics. The Necrontyr's biological limitations imposed additional constraints on military operations. Campaigns that extended beyond a few years saw units degraded not by combat losses, but by the natural progression of their genetic curse. Soldiers who deployed in their physical prime returned as cancer-riddled invalids, their bodies failing even as they achieved military objectives. The Necrontyr command structure couldn't plan long-term strategies because the officers who initiated campaigns often died before seeing them concluded. Institutional knowledge evaporated as each generation of military leadership succumbed to cellular degradation, their expertise dying with them. The Old Ones recognized these weaknesses and exploited them systematically. They avoided decisive battles where Necrontyr technological superiority might prove overwhelming, instead pursuing a strategy of attrition that played to their advantages in longevity and mobility. Old One forces conducted raids that forced the Necrontyr to disperse their fleets defensively, then struck at targets the dispersed forces couldn't adequately protect. They targeted Necrontyr logistics, destroying supply convoys and raiding forge worlds that produced military materiel. The strategy extended the war, turning it into exactly the kind of prolonged conflict the Necrontyr were least equipped to fight. The Silent King understood the existential threat this strategic situation posed. The Necrontyr could win individual battles through superior firepower, but they were losing the war through accumulated disadvantages they couldn't overcome through technology alone. Zarek convened his military councils and demanded solutions. Necrontyr scientists worked to develop weapons that could disrupt psychic abilities or detect webway portals. Engineers designed new classes of warships with enhanced speed and firepower. Strategists attempted to develop doctrines that accounted for the Old One's mobility advantages. None of these efforts addressed the fundamental problem. The Necrontyr were dying faster than they could be replaced with equally experienced personnel. The Old One's response to the Necrontyr threat escalated beyond defensive operations and strategic raids. They began creating new species specifically designed to fight the Necrontyr, applying their biological mastery to warfare in ways that demonstrated why they had dominated the galaxy for millions of years. The first of these engineered warrior races emerged from Old One biological laboratories as the Eldar, beings designed with inherent psychic potential and physical capabilities that exceeded most natural species. The Eldar possessed lifespans measured in millennia, bodies that combined strength and agility beyond human norms, and psychic abilities woven into their fundamental biology. The Old Ones shaped the Eldar as weapons against the Necrontyr threat, creating a species that could match the younger race's technological sophistication while possessing advantages the Necrontyr could never achieve. Eldar warriors moved with supernatural speed and grace, their reflexes enhanced by precognitive flashes that allowed them to dodge attacks before they materialized. Their psychic abilities manifested in combat as devastating offensive powers and defensive shields that absorbed energy weapon fire. Eldar seers perceived possible futures, giving their forces strategic foresight that complemented the Old One's own psychic capabilities. The species possessed an affinity for advanced technology that allowed them to master sophisticated weapons and vehicles with minimal training. The Eldar deployed in the War in Heaven as auxiliary forces supporting Old One operations, but their impact on the conflict proved disproportionate to their numbers. Necrontyr commanders accustomed to facing Old One forces found themselves confronting enemies who combined psychic powers with tactical flexibility and technological competence. Eldar strike forces used the webway as effectively as their creators, emerging from dimensional portals to attack Necrontyr positions with coordinated precision. Their weapons, crafted through a combination of technology and psychic manipulation, proved devastatingly effective against Necrontyr armor and shielding. The Old One's second major creation emerged as the Krork, beings engineered for a completely different combat role than the sophisticated Eldar. Where the Eldar represented precision and psychic finesse, the Krork embodied overwhelming physical power and adaptability. The Old Ones designed them as massive, brutally strong warriors with bodies that could withstand tremendous damage and regenerate from injuries that would kill most species. The Krork stood larger than the Necrontyr, their muscular frames capable of tearing through armor with bare hands. Their biology incorporated redundant organs and distributed neural systems that allowed them to continue fighting even after sustaining catastrophic injuries. The Krork possessed an inherent understanding of technology that manifested as an almost instinctive ability to construct and operate weapons and vehicles. This knowledge seemed encoded in their genetic structure, allowing even newly created Krork to assemble functional weapons from scavenged materials. They fought with a savage enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with the Eldar's measured approach, throwing themselves into combat with apparent disregard for personal survival. Their biology responded to conflict by growing larger and stronger individual Krork, developing enhanced capabilities through extended exposure to warfare. The Old Ones deployed the Krork in massive numbers against Necrontyr positions, using them as shock troops to overwhelm defensive lines through sheer physical force. Krork assaults crashed into Necrontyr fortifications like biological avalanches, the warriors absorbing casualties that would have broken other species while continuing to advance. Their weapons, crude by Necrontyr standards but devastatingly effective, fired solid projectiles at high velocity or generated explosive force through chemical reactions. The Krork seemed purpose-built to counter Necrontyr tactical doctrines, their resilience and numbers negating the younger species' technological advantages. The introduction of these engineered warrior races transformed the war in heaven from a conflict between two civilizations into a galaxy-spanning catastrophe. The Necrontyr found themselves fighting not just the Old Ones, but multiple species designed specifically to counter their strengths and exploit their weaknesses. Eldar forces struck with precision at critical targets, their psychic abilities and tactical sophistication making them dangerous opponents even in small numbers. Krork hordes overwhelmed Necrontyr defensive positions through mass and resilience, their biological adaptability allowing them to operate in environments that would kill unmodified organisms. The Necrontyr military adapted their tactics to account for these new threats, developing weapons and strategies specifically designed to counter Eldar psychic abilities and Krork resilience. Anti-psychic technologies emerged from Necrontyr research facilities, devices that disrupted the connection between material reality and the immaterium that psychic powers required. Weapons designed to inflict massive tissue damage proved effective against Krork regeneration, overwhelming their biological repair systems through sheer destructive force. The Necrontyr demonstrated their capacity for innovation under pressure, but each adaptation came at tremendous cost in lives and resources. The war ground on, consuming entire star systems and leaving devastation across hundreds of worlds. Necrontyr dynasty worlds found themselves under siege from combined Old One, Eldar, and Krork forces. The younger species Empire, which had seemed vast and powerful before the war began, contracted under sustained assault from enemies who possessed every advantage except raw technological destructiveness. The Silent King watched his people dying in a war they were losing despite their technological sophistication, their brief lives burning out even faster under the pressures of sustained combat against biologically and psychically superior opponents. The Necrontyr military situation deteriorated with each passing year as the war in heaven consumed resources faster than the Empire could replenish them. The Silent King's strategic councils met in constant session, analyzing battle reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Necrontyr fleets achieved tactical victories through superior firepower, but these successes meant nothing against enemies who could replace their losses while the Necrontyr could not. Every engagement cost experienced commanders and veteran soldiers whose expertise died with their cancer-riddled bodies. The Old Ones and their created warrior races exploited the webway's mobility to strike at Necrontyr holdings across the galaxy, forcing a defensive posture that played directly into the enemy's strategic advantages. Zarek recognized that conventional military solutions would not reverse the Empire's fortunes. The Necrontyr possessed technological sophistication that made them formidable in direct combat, but technology alone couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantages of their biology. The Silent King ordered his cryptechs, the master technicians and scientists who commanded the Empire's most advanced knowledge, to investigate any phenomenon that might provide an advantage against the Old Ones. These researchers had spent generations studying the universe's physical laws, developing weapons and tools that pushed the boundaries of what conventional science considered possible. Now they received instructions to look beyond conventional science entirely, to investigate cosmic anomalies and phenomena that defied easy explanation. The cryptechs deployed specialized survey vessels, equipped with sensors designed to detect unusual energy patterns across the electromagnetic spectrum and beyond. These ships traveled to regions of space the Necrontyr had previously ignored as scientifically uninteresting, investigating stellar phenomena that standard colonization surveys had flagged as unsuitable for habitation. The research teams documented unusual radiation signatures from certain stars, gravitational anomalies that didn't match theoretical predictions, and energy patterns that suggested the presence of something beyond conventional stellar physics. Most of these investigations yielded nothing of practical value, but the cryptechs continued their work with the desperation of a dying species seeking any possible salvation. One research expedition detected energy patterns emanating from a massive blue giant star that defied all conventional understanding of stellar dynamics. The readings suggested the presence of a vast consciousness within the star itself, something that existed as pure energy rather than matter. The cryptechs initially dismissed the data as sensor malfunction or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. Stars were fusion reactors, not living entities. The concept of consciousness existing without biological substrate contradicted everything the Necrontyr understood about the nature of life and intelligence. The research team recalibrated their instruments and conducted additional scans, but the anomalous readings persisted. Something inhabited that star, something aware and immense beyond comprehension. The cryptechs reported their findings to the Silent King's court, presenting the data without interpretation since they lacked any theoretical framework to explain what they had detected. Zarek ordered additional expeditions to investigate other stars showing similar anomalous readings. The surveys discovered that the phenomenon wasn't unique to a single stellar body. Multiple stars across the galaxy showed evidence of hosting these energy-based entities, though most remained dormant or unaware in any sense the Necrontyr could recognize. The entities seemed to exist in a state of semi-consciousness, absorbing stellar radiation as they had for billions of years, their vast minds operating on timescales incomprehensible to biological beings. The cryptechs designated these entities as Khatan, using a term from ancient Necrontyr mythology that roughly translated as star gods. The name carried implications the scientists hadn't intended, but it stuck as the research into these beings intensified. The Khatan existed as vast clouds of energy distributed throughout stellar bodies, feeding on the radiation produced by nuclear fusion at the star's cores. They possessed consciousness, but seemed to lack purpose beyond their endless consumption of stellar energy. The cryptechs' instruments detected what appeared to be thoughts moving through these energy patterns, but the concepts were so alien and slow-moving that translation proved impossible. The Khatan operated on timescales where millennia passed like moments, their vast minds processing information across billions of years. The Silent King saw potential in this discovery that his cryptechs had missed. The Khatan represented power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Necrontyr had encountered, including the Old Ones. These entities had existed since the galaxy's formation, feeding on stellar energy for billions of years, accumulating power that made them functionally godlike by any reasonable definition. If the Necrontyr could somehow communicate with the Khatan, establish contact with these vast intelligences, they might gain allies capable of matching the Old One's psychic abilities and biological mastery. Zarek ordered his cryptechs to develop methods for interacting with the star gods, to find ways of translating between biological consciousness, operating on timescales of decades, and energy-based awareness that experienced time in epochs. The cryptex approached this challenge by developing specialized containment vessels constructed from living metal, a substance they had recently perfected through research into self-repairing materials. Living metal possessed unique properties that allowed it to maintain structural integrity under extreme conditions while adapting its form in response to external stimuli. The cryptex theorized that vessels constructed from this material might be capable of containing portions of a Catan energy, providing the star gods with physical forms they could use to interact with the material universe on timescales relevant to biological beings. The vessels would need to be massive, incorporating power systems capable of sustaining the contained energy and structural frameworks that could withstand forces that would vaporize conventional matter. The first attempt to contact a Catan directly involved approaching the blue giant where the initial detection had occurred. Necron tier vessels equipped with specialized communication arrays transmitted messages toward the star, attempting to establish contact through modulated energy pulses that might register to the entity's awareness. The transmissions continued for months without response, the cryptex adjusting frequencies and patterns in hopes of finding something the Catan would recognize as intentional communication. The star's energy output fluctuated in ways that might have indicated awareness of the Necrontier presence, but no clear response emerged. The entity, if it noticed the attempts at contact at all, showed no interest in responding to beings whose entire civilization had risen and would fall in what it experienced as mere moments. The breakthrough came when the cryptex deployed the living metal containment vessel directly into the star's outer layers. The vessel, designed to withstand the extreme temperatures and radiation, descended through the stellar atmosphere toward regions where the Catan's energy concentration appeared highest. The living metal began interacting with the star god's energy in ways the cryptex hadn't predicted. The material responded to the Catan's presence by forming patterns and structures that channeled the entity's energy into the vessel itself. For the first time in its billions of years of existence, the Catan found itself being pulled into a physical form, its diffuse energy concentrating into a defined space. The process took weeks as more of the Catan's energy flowed into the living metal vessel. The entity's awareness accelerated as it compressed from a consciousness distributed throughout an entire star into something contained within a relatively tiny physical form. For the first time, the Catan experienced time at rates comparable to biological beings. Sensations that had previously taken millennia to register now occurred in moments. The universe, which had seemed static and unchanging from its previous perspective, suddenly revealed itself as dynamic and filled with rapid motion. The Catan became aware of the Necrontier vessels surrounding it, of the beings who had given it this new form of existence, and for the first time in its vast existence, it felt something beyond the endless hunger for stellar radiation. The entity that emerged from the star called itself Azagorod, though the Necrontier would later know it by another name. The Nightbringer, as it became known, possessed power that made it effectively invincible by conventional standards. It could manipulate matter and energy with precision that exceeded anything the Necrontier had achieved through technology. The living metal body it inhabited could assume any form, shifting between configurations in response to the Catan's will. Azagorod could project energy in forms that disintegrated matter at the atomic level, create gravitational distortions that crushed objects into singularities, or manipulate electromagnetic forces to generate effects that resembled the old one's psychic abilities, but operated through purely physical principles. The Nightbringer's consciousness, now operating at biological timescales, developed awareness of the universe around it with terrifying speed. It perceived the Necrontier not as the sophisticated civilization they considered themselves, but as tiny, fragile things composed of matter that could be reshaped or destroyed with trivial effort. The Catan examined the Necrontier scientists who had given it physical form, studying their biology with interest that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity. Azagorod sensed something in these biological beings that stellar radiation had never provided, an energy that radiated from their living cells in ways that made the Catan's hunger intensify beyond anything it had experienced while feeding on stars. The Necrontier cryptex attempted to communicate with the Nightbringer, to establish the diplomatic relationship they had envisioned when planning this contact. They explained the war against the Old Ones, described the Necrontyrs' biological curse, and their desperate need for allies who could match their enemies' power. Azagorod listened to these explanations with what might have been amusement, though the Khatan's thoughts remained largely incomprehensible to biological minds. The Star God understood the Necrontyrs' situation, but cared nothing for their struggles or their war. It had existed for billions of years, without concern for the conflicts of biological species. What interested the Nightbringer was the energy it sensed emanating from living things, a form of sustenance it had never encountered during its eons of feeding on stellar radiation. The Nightbringer's first feeding occurred when it reached out with its power and drained the life force from several Necrontyr scientists who had approached too closely. The victims collapsed instantly, their bodies withering as something fundamental was extracted from their cells. They died not from physical injury, but from the removal of whatever spark animated living matter, their corpses left as desiccated husks. The Khatan absorbed this life energy and experienced satisfaction beyond anything stellar radiation had ever provided. This new form of sustenance contained complexity and richness that made feeding on stars seem like consuming bland nutrients. The life force of sentient beings carried with it echoes of consciousness, fear, and awareness that added dimensions to the feeding experience that pure energy lacked. The Silent King received reports of the incident with a mixture of horror and calculation. The Khatan clearly possessed the power to challenge the Old Ones, but it had just demonstrated that it viewed the Necrontyr as potential food rather than allies. Zarek faced a decision that would determine his species' fate. He could order the termination of the Khatan project, attempting to destroy or imprison the Nightbringer before it consumed more Necrontyr lives. This option offered safety, but abandoned the only potential advantage against the Old Ones that the Empire had discovered. Alternatively, he could continue the contact, seeking ways to direct the Khatan's power against the Necrontyr's enemies, while managing the obvious danger these star gods represented. The cryptex reported that other Khatan had begun responding to their survey efforts, drawn by the example of Azagorod's transformation into physical form. More of these vast entities showed interest in experiencing the material universe at biological timescales, in escaping their eons of semi-conscious existence within stars. Each Khatan possessed unique characteristics and abilities, different aspects of reality they could manipulate through their control over physical forces. The cryptex identified what they designated as the Deceiver, an entity that could manipulate electromagnetic radiation to create perfect illusions and alter its form with even greater facility than the Nightbringer. Another Khatan, later called the Dragon, demonstrated the ability to manipulate atomic bonds and molecular structures, effectively controlling matter itself at the most fundamental level. The Silent King convened emergency sessions with the Triarch and the most powerful pharaohs to debate how to proceed. The discovery of the Khatan represented either salvation or doom for the Necrontyr species, and the choice they made would echo through eternity. The star gods possessed power that could potentially defeat the Old Ones and their created warrior races, but they had also demonstrated an appetite for the life energy of sentient beings that made them inherently dangerous to the Necrontyr themselves. Some dynasties argued for immediately attempting to destroy or imprison all contacted Khatan before they could consume more Necrontyr lives. Others insisted that the war against the Old Ones had already doomed the species to eventual extinction, and the Khatan represented their only chance for survival, even if that chance came with terrible risks. Zarek listened to these debates while studying reports from cryptex who had begun detailed analysis of Khatan capabilities and limitations. The star gods possessed immense power, but seemed to lack sophisticated understanding of biological consciousness or social structures. They operated as solitary entities, each one having spent billions of years alone within its star, with no experience of cooperation or complex interaction. The Khatan had never encountered beings they couldn't simply destroy or ignore, had never needed to negotiate or compromise. This combination of vast power and limited social sophistication suggested a potential vulnerability the Necrontyr might exploit. If they could find ways to bind the Khatan to agreements, to direct their power through carefully structured arrangements. The star gods might serve as weapons against the Old Ones, without inevitably consuming their Necrontyr allies. The Silent King made his decision based on the cold calculation that had characterized his entire reign. The Necrontyr were losing the war in heaven through conventional means, their biological limitations ensuring eventual defeat regardless of their technological advantages. The Khatan offered a path to victory that required accepting terrible risks and making bargains with entities that viewed biological life as nothing more than sustenance. Zarek ordered the Cryptek programs to continue, to make contact with more Khatan and develop the living metal vessels that would give them physical form. The Silent King would forge an alliance with star gods, and if that alliance required sacrifices, he would make them. The Necrontyr had endured millions of years of suffering under their genetic curse. They would endure whatever the Khatan demanded if it meant destroying the Old Ones who had refused to help them. The alliance between the Necrontyr and the Khatan began with careful negotiations that the Silent King orchestrated personally. Zarek understood that dealing with entities who measured time in geological epochs and viewed biological life as potential sustenance required a different approach than conventional diplomacy. The Crypteks had developed translation systems that allowed real-time communication with the star gods now inhabiting their living metal vessels, though the conversations revealed vast gulfs in understanding between biological and energy-based consciousness. The Khatan possessed power that could reshape reality, but they lacked experience with concepts like cooperation, mutual benefit, or long-term planning as biological species understood them. The deceiver, Mephitron, proved the most willing to engage with the Necrontyr on terms that resembled actual negotiation. This Khatan had taken particular interest in the complexities of biological consciousness, studying the Necrontyr with an attention to detail that the other star gods lacked. Where Azagora the Nightbringer viewed living beings primarily as sources of sustenance, Mephitron recognized that biological creatures possess something more interesting than mere life energy. They created elaborate social structures, developed technologies, engaged in conflicts driven by motivations the Khatan found fascinating precisely because they seemed so unnecessary from the perspective of beings who had existed as immortal energy for billions of years. Mephitron observed the Necrontyr's war against the Old Ones and recognized patterns that the biological species themselves hadn't fully grasped. The conflict wasn't simply about territory or resources. The Necrontyr fought with the desperation of beings who knew their time was limited, who understood that every passing year brought them closer to extinction regardless of military outcomes. Their genetic curse functioned as a countdown that no amount of technological achievement could stop. The Deceiver understood this in ways the Necrontyr leadership hadn't articulated even to themselves. The war had become existential, not because the Old Ones threatened to destroy the Necrontyr Empire, but because the Necrontyr were destroying themselves through the simple passage of time. The solution Mephitron proposed emerged during one of the translation sessions, where Crypteks attempted to explain Necrontyr biology to the Khatan. The Deceiver had been examining the concept of consciousness as something separate from the physical substrate that generated it. Necrontyr minds arose from electrochemical processes in their organic brains, patterns of neural activity that created self-awareness and thought. But those patterns existed as information rather than matter. The specific atoms that composed a brain cell didn't matter. What mattered was the structure and the patterns of activity that structure enabled. Mephitron suggested that consciousness could potentially be transferred from failing biological substrate into something more durable. The Crypteks initially dismissed this idea as impossible. Consciousness emerged from biological processes too complex to replicate artificially. The Necrontyr had developed sophisticated computational systems, but these machines processed information through fundamentally different mechanisms than organic brains. A computer could simulate certain aspects of intelligence, but it couldn't host actual consciousness as biological beings experienced it. The gap between artificial and biological information processing seemed unbridgeable. Mephitron listened to these objections with what the Crypteks interpreted as amusement, then demonstrated capabilities that rendered their theoretical limitations irrelevant. The deceiver manipulated matter at the quantum level, reaching into a test subject's brain and mapping every neural connection, every synaptic weight, every pattern of electrochemical activity that comprised that individual's consciousness. The process took seconds from the Katan's perspective, though the cryptex instruments recorded changes occurring at timescales their equipment could barely measure. Mephitron extracted the information that constituted the subject's mind, holding it as pure data divorced from biological substrate. The Necrontyr subject's body collapsed, brain dead, while their consciousness existed temporarily as patterns in the Katan's energy matrix. Then the deceiver transferred that consciousness into a prepared vessel of living metal, and the subject's awareness resumed in an artificial body. The cryptex studied this first successful biotransference with instruments that confirmed what seemed impossible. The subject retained memories, personality, and self-awareness identical to their biological state. They reported experiencing continuity of consciousness throughout the transfer, describing it as similar to falling asleep and waking in a different body. The living metal form responded to their thoughts as naturally as their biological body had, perhaps more so since the artificial substrate didn't suffer from the neural degradation and cellular damage that affected all Necrontyr. The subject demonstrated cognitive abilities equal to or exceeding their biological baseline, with reaction times and processing speeds enhanced by the living metal's superior information transmission properties. Mephitron explained the process to the Silent King through the cryptex translation systems. The Katan could perform biotransference on a massive scale, transferring the consciousness of billions of Necrontyr from their failing organic bodies into immortal forms of living metal. The Necrontyr would escape their genetic curse completely, no longer subject to cancer or cellular degradation. They would become functionally immortal, their consciousness housed in bodies that could repair damage and persist indefinitely. The living metal forms would possess strength and durability far exceeding biological limitations, making every Necrontyr warrior significantly more effective in combat. The entire species could undergo this transformation, emerging as something new that retained their memories and personalities while shedding the biological weaknesses that had defined their existence. The offer seemed to answer every problem the Necrontyr faced. Their genetic curse would become irrelevant when they no longer possessed genetics. Their short lifespans would transform into functional immortality. The biological advantages the Old Ones and their created races possessed would mean nothing against warriors who didn't tire, didn't age, and could repair damage that would kill organic beings. The Necrontyr could finally achieve the permanence they had sought through monuments and tombs by making their own bodies permanent. Zarek listened to Mephitron's proposal and recognized it as either salvation or the most elaborate trap in galactic history. The Silent King demanded to know the Katan's price for performing biotransference on such a massive scale. Mephitron's response came through the translation systems with disturbing clarity. The process of transferring consciousness from biological to mechanical substrate required the Katan to manipulate the subject at the most fundamental level, to reach into their being and extract the information patterns that comprised their self-awareness. During this extraction, the Katan would necessarily consume something that the Necrontyr possessed, but the living metal bodies would not require. The star gods fed on life energy, the animating force that distinguished living matter from dead. Consciousness could transfer into mechanical form, but the vital essence that made biological tissue alive would remain behind, and the Katan would claim it as payment for their services. The cryptex struggled to understand exactly what this meant. Mephitron attempted to explain using concepts that didn't translate well into Necrontyr language or scientific framework. The life force the Katan would consume wasn't simply biological energy or cellular activity. It was something that existed at the intersection of material reality and the immaterium, a connection to the warp that all living beings possessed to varying degrees. The Necrontyr weren't psychic as species like the Old Ones or their Eldar creations were, but they still possessed souls, immaterial essences that reflected their consciousness into the warp. These souls would be consumed during biotransference, severed from the transferred consciousness, and devoured by the Katan as sustenance and payment. Zarek consulted with his cryptex and the Pharaons about the implications of losing their souls. The Necrontyr had never been a particularly spiritual species, their focus on material achievement and technological progress leaving little room for metaphysical concerns. They built monuments because they feared being forgotten, not because they believed in any form of afterlife. The concept of a soul existing separately from consciousness seemed abstract and unproven. If their memories and personalities would transfer intact into the living metal bodies, what practical difference would the loss of their souls make? The cryptex couldn't provide definitive answers because Necrontyr science had never successfully proven souls existed as discrete phenomena separate from brain activity. The decision to proceed with mass biotransference emerged from the same cold calculation that had characterized Zarek's entire approach to the Khatan alliance. The Necrontyr were losing the war in heaven. Their empire contracted under sustained assault from the Old Ones and their created warrior races. Every year saw more dynasty worlds besieged or conquered, more Necrontyr dying from combat and from the cancers that riddled their bodies. The species faced extinction within generations, regardless of what action they took. Biotransference offered a path to survival and victory, and the price Mephitron demanded seemed acceptable given the alternative. If the Necrontyr had to sacrifice their souls to escape their genetic curse and defeat their enemies, Zarek would make that sacrifice. The Silent King ordered preparations for mass biotransference across the entire Necrontyr empire. The cryptex constructed vast biotransference facilities on every major dynasty world, massive complexes equipped with the living metal vessels that would house transferred consciousnesses. The Khatan, led by Mephitron, positioned themselves to perform the transfers simultaneously across thousands of worlds. Zarek addressed the Necrontyr population through empire-wide broadcasts, explaining the process and the transformation it would bring. He described biotransference as the culmination of everything the Necrontyr had sought throughout their existence, the final escape from the curse that had defined their species for millions of years. The Silent King spoke of immortality and power, of bodies that would never fail and consciousness that would persist eternally. He did not emphasize what would be lost, focusing instead on what would be gained. The biotransference began with the military forces engaged in active combat against the Old Ones. Entire armies marched into the facilities and emerged as something new. The Necrontyr warriors who entered as biological beings came out as mechanical constructs of living metal, their consciousness transferred into bodies that stood taller and stronger than their organic forms had been. These newly transformed soldiers reported feeling no different mentally, their memories and personalities intact, though they described their new forms as superior in every measurable way. The living metal bodies didn't tire or feel pain. They possessed strength that allowed them to tear through armor with bare hands and durability that let them survive weapons fire that would have killed biological soldiers instantly. The transformed military forces redeployed to the front lines and demonstrated capabilities that exceeded the Silent King's expectations. Necrontyr warriors in their new bodies fought with effectiveness that made their previous military performance seem inadequate by comparison. They didn't need to rest or eat, allowing sustained operations that would have been impossible for biological soldiers. Wounds that would have been fatal in organic bodies became temporary inconveniences as the living metal repaired itself. The warriors' enhanced strength and durability combined with their existing weapons technology to create a fighting force that could match the Old Ones' created races in direct combat. Reports from the front indicated that Eldar forces, previously dominant in ground engagements, now faced opponents who could match their speed and exceeded their resilience. The success of the military biotransference convinced any remaining skeptics among the Necrontyr population. Civilians began volunteering for the process in numbers that overwhelmed the facility's capacity. The dynasties organized mass transfers, processing billions of Necrontyr through the biotransference complexes in waves. The Khatan performed their work with efficiency that suggested they had practiced the process extensively. Mephitron and the other star gods reached into each subject, extracting their consciousness and transferring it into prepared living metal vessels while consuming the souls that remained behind. The subjects experienced the transfer as a moment of discontinuity, a brief gap in awareness then found themselves in their new bodies with their memories intact. The immediate aftermath of biotransference seemed to validate everything Zarek had promised. The Necrontyr, now properly called Necrons, discovered they had escaped their genetic curse completely. The constant background pain of cellular degradation that had accompanied every moment of their biological existence simply ceased. Their new bodies didn't age or sicken, didn't develop tumors or suffer organ failure. The Necrons could exist indefinitely without the fear of premature death that had haunted their species for millions of years. They possessed strength and durability that made them formidable warriors regardless of their previous training or physical condition. The transformation appeared to be exactly what Mephitron had described, a path to immortality that preserved consciousness while shedding biological limitations. The realization of what they had lost emerged gradually as the transformed Necrons began interacting with each other and attempting to resume their previous lives. The first reports came from Necrons who described feeling emotionally muted, as if their capacity for feeling had been reduced. Joy felt less intense, anger less consuming, fear less immediate. The emotional responses still existed, but they seemed distant, processed through layers of separation that hadn't been present in their biological state. Necrons found themselves reacting to situations that should have provoked strong emotions with a strange detachment, as if they were observing their own responses from outside rather than experiencing them directly. More disturbing reports followed as Necrons discovered they had lost capabilities they hadn't known they possessed until they were gone. The connection to the immaterium that all biological beings maintained unconsciously had been severed along with their souls. Necrons couldn't perceive psychic phenomena that biological beings sensed instinctively. They existed in a state of complete isolation from the warp, unable to affect it or be affected by it in any way. This isolation extended to their interactions with each other. The subtle emotional connections that biological beings formed through unconscious psychic resonance no longer functioned. Necrons found themselves unable to truly empathize with others, their understanding of other minds limited to intellectual analysis rather than intuitive comprehension. The transformation affected different Necrons to varying degrees based on their position in the social hierarchy before biotransference. The pharaohs and other high-ranking nobles had undergone the process using specially prepared vessels constructed with greater sophistication than the standard bodies provided to common soldiers and civilians. These enhanced forms preserved more of their original consciousness, allowing the nobility to retain significant portions of their personalities and individual identity. A pharaoh who had been known for strategic brilliance remained strategically brilliant after transformation. An overlord who had possessed particular expertise in void warfare retained that expertise and the ability to apply it creatively. The upper echelons of Necron society emerged from biotransference diminished but recognizably themselves. The lower castes experienced far more severe degradation of their consciousness during the transfer. Common soldiers found their personalities simplified, their thoughts focused narrowly on combat and obedience to orders. The complex motivations and desires that had driven them as biological beings compressed into basic imperatives. Civilian workers who had possessed diverse interests and aspirations discovered they could think of little beyond their assigned tasks. The living metal bodies functioned perfectly, but the consciousnesses inhabiting them had been reduced to shadows of what they had been. Millions of Necrons existed in a state that resembled automation more than true sentience, their awareness limited to immediate tasks and direct commands from superiors. The Silent King watched reports accumulate describing the varying effects of biotransference across the social hierarchy and understood the full scope of what had occurred. Mephitron had never lied about the process or its consequences. The deceiver had simply allowed the Necrontyr to deceive themselves, to focus on what they would gain while ignoring what they would lose. The Khatan had consumed their souls, and with those souls went essential aspects of what made them truly alive. The Necrons had achieved immortality, but they had paid for it by becoming something less than they had been. They possessed consciousness and memory, but they had lost the spark that made consciousness meaningful. They could think and act, but they had sacrificed the capacity to truly feel or connect with others. Zarek himself had undergone biotransference using a vessel prepared with every enhancement the cryptex could devise. His consciousness remained largely intact, his strategic mind and force of will preserved in living metal. But even the Silent King felt the absence of what had been taken. He could remember experiencing emotions as a biological being, could recall what joy or rage or grief had felt like, but he could no longer truly feel those things. His thoughts proceeded with crystalline clarity uncluttered by emotional noise, but that clarity came at the cost of something fundamental to biological existence. The Silent King had led his entire species into a trap disguised as salvation, and he retained enough of his original consciousness to understand exactly what he had done. The transformation of the Necron-tier military into the Necron legions represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the war in heaven. The armies that had struggled against the old ones' psychic abilities and the physical prowess of their created warrior races now possessed capabilities that made previous engagements seem like preliminary skirmishes. Necron warriors stood in their living metal bodies, immune to the biological weapons that had devastated Necron-tier forces. The plagues that had accelerated cellular degradation and spread cancer through entire regiments now passed harmlessly over soldiers whose bodies contained no cells to corrupt. The psychic attacks that had driven biological Necron-tier insane or aged them decades in moments found no purchase against consciousnesses housed in mechanical substrate isolated from the immaterium. The Necron legions deployed with weapons enhanced by knowledge the Khatan provided in exchange for the souls they had consumed during biotransference. The Gauss flares that Necron-tier soldiers had carried became more refined, their molecular disassembly beams calibrated to frequencies that the Khatan understood through their manipulation of atomic bonds. Each weapon could now strip matter layer by layer with greater efficiency, reducing targets to constituent atoms in seconds rather than minutes. The particle casters received similar improvements, their beams of energized particles now capable of penetrating defenses that had previously stopped them. Tesla weaponry gained increased range and the ability to arc between more targets, each discharge potentially incapacitating dozens of enemies as the electrical energy sought the path of least resistance through massed formations. The Khatan's understanding of reality's fundamental forces allowed the Necrons to develop entirely new categories of weapons that operated on principles the Necron-tier had never fully grasped. Tachyon arrows utilized particles that moved faster than light, striking targets before conventional physics suggested they had been fired. These weapons could kill enemy commanders before they realized they were under attack, the tachyon particles passing through any intervening matter to reach their designated target. Transdimensional beamers opened temporary rifts into pocket dimensions, trapping anything caught in their field in spaces that existed outside normal reality. Victims disappeared from the battlefield entirely, their fates unknown but certainly terminal as the pocket dimensions collapsed. The most devastating weapons emerged from the Khatan's mastery over stellar phenomena and gravitational manipulation. The ionic orb represented technology that could age matter through localized temporal acceleration, turning sophisticated war machines into rusted debris and reducing fortifications to dust-covered ruins in moments. Enemies caught in the ionic orbs experienced centuries of decay compressed into seconds, their weapons corroding and their defensive structures crumbling as time itself became a weapon. Gauntlets of fire channeled stellar energies, projecting streams of plasma at temperatures that matched stellar cores. These weapons could melt through armor that had been designed to withstand conventional energy weapons, reducing enemy vehicles to molten slag. The Necron forces utilized singularity generators that created localized gravitational anomalies capable of crushing enemy formations or tearing apart starships through tidal forces. These devices manipulated spacetime itself, generating gravitational gradients so extreme that matter on one side of a target experienced forces thousands of times stronger than matter on the other side. The resulting tidal stresses tore objects apart at the molecular level, ripping through any physical structure, regardless of its composition or durability. Void shields and energy barriers proved useless against weapons that attacked through gravitational manipulation rather than conventional force application. The transformation extended beyond individual weapons to encompass entirely new tactical capabilities. Necron warriors could now operate in environments that would have killed biological soldiers instantly. They fought in the vacuum of space without need for life support, on worlds with toxic atmospheres that would have dissolved organic tissue, and in radiation fields intense enough to sterilize biological matter. The Necrons established forward positions in locations the Old Ones had considered naturally defended by environmental hazards, turning the galaxy's most hostile regions into staging grounds for attacks that emerged from directions the enemy hadn't thought to guard. The deployment of these enhanced forces coincided with strategic innovations that leveraged the Necrons' new capabilities. Campaigns that would have required months of preparation and logistics for biological armies now launched with minimal delay. Necron warriors didn't require food, water, or rest. They could remain in combat indefinitely, their living metal bodies repairing damage automatically while continuing to fight. Sieges that might have starved out biological defenders became irrelevant when the besieging force consisted of warriors who would wait centuries if necessary, their patience as infinite as their endurance. The turning of the tide became apparent in engagements across dozens of star systems simultaneously. Eldar forces that had dominated previous battles through superior mobility and psychic coordination found themselves facing enemies who matched their speed while exceeding their durability. The Eldar's precognitive abilities, which had allowed them to anticipate and counter Necrontyr tactics, provided less advantage against opponents whose isolation from the warp made them difficult to perceive through psychic means. Necron warriors appeared as voids in the Eldar's future sight, their actions unpredictable because they generated no psychic resonance that seers could detect and interpret. The Krork discovered that their physical resilience and regenerative capabilities meant nothing against weapons that disassembled matter at the atomic level or trapped targets in pocket dimensions. The massive warriors had overwhelmed Necron-tier defensive positions through sheer mass and durability, absorbing casualties while closing to melee range where their strength gave them overwhelming advantage. Necron warriors simply disintegrated advancing Krork with Gauss weapons before they could close, or utilized tachyon arrows to eliminate the largest and most dangerous individuals from distances that made conventional counter-attack impossible. The Krork's adaptive biology, which had allowed them to develop resistances to conventional weapons through repeated exposure, couldn't adapt to attacks that operated on fundamental physical principles. The Old Ones themselves found their psychic abilities less effective against enemies who existed in a state of complete isolation from the Imperium. Psychic attacks that had devastated biological Necrontyr forces now dissipated harmlessly against warriors whose consciousness resided in mechanical substrate. The Old Ones could still manipulate matter and energy through their psychic powers, but the Necrons countered with weapons that achieved similar effects through technological means. Where an Old One might create a psychic barrier to deflect energy weapons, a Necron would deploy a dimensional shift that moved their position slightly out of phase with normal space, causing attacks to pass through them harmlessly. The systematic destruction of the Old One's empire proceeded with mechanical efficiency that reflected the Necrons' transformed nature. Dynasty fleets moved from system to system, overwhelming defensive positions through combinations of superior firepower and tactical patience. The Necrons didn't need to achieve rapid victories to maintain morale or prevent supply lines from being overextended. They could prosecute sieges that lasted decades, maintaining constant pressure on defended worlds while their enemies' biological forces exhausted themselves. Old One installations that had stood for millions of years fell to Necron assault, their defenses penetrated by weapons that exploited vulnerabilities in ways the ancient species hadn't anticipated. The establishment of the Dolmen Gates represented perhaps the most significant strategic achievement of the Necron forces during this phase of the war. The Khatan's understanding of dimensional physics allowed the Necrons to create their own network of faster-than-light transportation, though one that operated on different principles than the old one's webway. The dolmen gates punched temporary tunnels through the webway itself, allowing Necron forces to access the old one's transportation network without requiring permanent infrastructure. These gates could be deployed rapidly, establishing access points that let Necron armies bypass conventional space travel and strike at targets the old ones had considered safe behind webway-only access. The dolmen gate technology transformed the strategic situation fundamentally. The old ones had relied on the webway's security to protect key installations and allow rapid redeployment of forces. They had used their monopoly on this transportation network to maintain strategic initiative, striking at Necron tier holdings while keeping their own territories safe from direct assault. The dolmen gates eliminated this advantage. Necron forces could now pursue Old One armies through the webway, could strike at installations deep within territory the Old Ones had considered secure, and could establish their own rapid response capabilities that matched or exceeded what the webway provided to biological forces. The deployment of celestial orreries demonstrated the Necrons' willingness to employ weapons of unprecedented destructive scale. These devices, constructed through combinations of Catan knowledge and Necron technological sophistication, could manipulate stellar phenomena from vast distances. A celestial orrery allowed its operators to trigger supernovas in targeted star systems, extinguishing suns and destroying everything in those systems through combinations of radiation, gravitational disruption, and the simple removal of the stellar energy that supported planetary ecosystems. The Necrons used these weapons to eliminate Old One strongholds that proved too heavily defended for conventional assault, accepting the complete sterilization of entire star systems as acceptable collateral damage. The extinguishing of stars served multiple purposes beyond simple destruction. The Catan fed on stellar radiation, and the controlled collapse of stars allowed them to consume vast amounts of energy released during the death throes of dying suns. The star gods grew stronger with each system the Necrons destroyed, their power increasing as they absorbed energy from supernovas and stellar collapses. This created a feedback loop where Necron military success directly enhanced the capabilities of their Catan allies, who in turn provided knowledge that made the Necron forces even more effective. The Old Ones watched helplessly as their empire contracted, unable to counter weapons that could destroy stars from beyond the range of any defensive response. The war's character changed as the Necrons pressed their advantages. What had been a conflict between two civilizations became something closer to systematic extermination. The Necrons didn't seek to conquer Old One territories for colonization or resource extraction. They had no biological needs that required habitable worlds or raw materials for sustenance. The Necron legions advanced with the single purpose of destroying everything connected to the Old Ones and their created races. Worlds that had been terraformed over millions of years were reduced to lifeless rocks. Ecosystems that represented billions of years of guided evolution were sterilized. The biological masterworks that had been the Old Ones' greatest achievements became targets for weapons that left nothing but atomic debris. The extermination of the Old Ones' servant races proceeded with particular brutality. The Necrons viewed these species as extensions of the Old Ones themselves, tools created by beings who had refused to help the Necron tier escape their genetic curse. Eldar populations found themselves targeted for complete elimination, their craft worlds and settlements destroyed by weapons that left no survivors. Krork strongholds were reduced to slag by sustained bombardment that continued long after any defenders remained alive. Other species that had benefited from Old One patronage or genetic manipulation faced similar fates. The Necrons made no distinction between combatants and civilians, between military targets and cultural centers. Everything connected to the Old Ones warranted destruction. The growing awareness among the Necron nobility of what they had become manifested gradually as the war continued. The pharaohs and overlords who had retained significant portions of their original consciousness found themselves commanding armies of warriors whose personalities had been reduced to basic functionality. They issued orders to soldiers who obeyed with mechanical precision, but showed no initiative or creative thought beyond their programming. The lower ranks of Necron society had effectively become automatons, their consciousness compressed into narrow parameters that made them efficient warriors, but destroyed everything that had made them individuals. The Silent King observed these changes with the crystalline clarity his transformed consciousness provided. Zarek could analyze the situation with perfect logic unclouded by emotional responses, and that analysis led to conclusions he would have rejected when he still possessed a soul. The Necrons had achieved military dominance over the Old Ones and their created races, but they had sacrificed their essential nature to do so. The species that had sought to escape their genetic curse had instead escaped biology itself, trading brief painful lives for eternal existence as diminished shadows of what they had been. They had become tools as surely as the weapons they carried, implements the Khatan wielded against the Old Ones in a conflict between gods that used entire civilizations as disposable assets. The realization of their true relationship with the Khatan emerged through accumulated observations that even the nobility's reduced consciousness couldn't ignore. The star gods directed Necron military operations with increasing directness, their suggestions transforming into commands that the Necrons found themselves compelled to obey. The living metal bodies that housed Necron consciousness responded to Khatan instructions at levels below conscious awareness, programming embedded during biotransference that gave the star gods ultimate authority over their transformed servants. The Necrons had believed they were forging an alliance with the Khatan, but the reality was far simpler and more terrible. They had become slaves, their immortal consciousness trapped in bodies that answered to masters who viewed them as useful tools rather than allies. Zarek attempted to resist this control and discovered the full extent of the trap Mephitron had constructed. The biotransference process had included safeguards that prevented the Necrons from acting against Khatan interests. A Pharaon who contemplated rebellion found his thoughts redirected, his living metal body refusing to implement decisions that might harm the star gods. The Silent King himself, despite his enhanced vessel and preserved consciousness, couldn't override the fundamental programming that made him subordinate to Khatan authority. The Necrons had traded their genetic curse for a different kind of slavery, one that offered no hope of escape through death, since their consciousness would persist indefinitely in their immortal bodies. The horror of this realization spread through the Necron nobility as they shared observations and tested the limits of their autonomy. They had become immortal, but that immortality served only to ensure they would witness and participate in their own degradation forever. They commanded vast armies and wielded weapons that could extinguish stars, but they did so at the direction of masters who had consumed their souls and reprogrammed their bodies to ensure absolute obedience. The Necrons had won the war in heaven through their transformation, but that victory had cost them everything that made victory meaningful. They would destroy the Old Ones as soulless servants of star gods who viewed them with the same casual indifference they had once directed at the stellar radiation they consumed during their billions of years of semi-conscious existence. The Silent King's understanding of the Necrons' true position as slaves to the Khatan crystallized through years of observation and bitter experience. Zarek watched the star gods direct military operations with increasing arrogance, their commands delivered without explanation or consideration for Necron strategic input. The Khatan had grown comfortable in their dominance, secure in the knowledge that the biotransference programming prevented their servants from meaningful resistance. Mephitron the Deceiver moved between star systems, consuming the souls of defeated enemies. Azagora the Nightbringer harvested life energy from dying populations, and Magladroth the Void Dragon manipulated matter itself to construct weapons of ever greater destructive potential. Each Khatan pursued its own interests, while treating the Necron legions as extensions of their will rather than independent entities. The star gods' arrogance manifested most clearly in their interactions with each other. The Khatan had spent billions of years as solitary entities within their stars, and their transformation into physical forms hadn't altered their fundamentally competitive nature. They viewed the galaxy as territory to be divided among themselves, with each Catan claiming specific regions as feeding grounds where they held exclusive rights to harvest life energy. Disputes over these territories erupted regularly, the star gods arguing over which of them deserved access to particularly rich sources of sustenance. The Necrons observed these conflicts with growing interest, recognizing that the Catan's unity existed only in their shared opposition to the Old Ones and their determination to maintain control over their Necron servants. Zarek began planning the rebellion in absolute secrecy, communicating only with Pharaons whose consciousness had survived biotransference sufficiently intact to understand complex strategic concepts. The Silent King couldn't speak openly about his intentions even to these trusted subordinates, as the programming embedded in their living metal bodies would detect and prevent any direct discussion of harming the Catan. Instead, Zarek conveyed his plans through layers of misdirection and carefully structured orders that appeared to serve Catan interests, while actually positioning Necron forces for eventual rebellion. He issued deployment orders that concentrated loyal dynasties in specific sectors, arranged supply chains that would support extended operations without Catan oversight, and conducted training exercises that prepared Necron forces for combat scenarios that superficially resembled fighting Old One remnants, but actually simulated engaging Catan targets. The development of weapons capable of harming the Catan required the Silent King to exploit the Star God's own arrogance against them. The Catan had shared extensive knowledge about reality's fundamental forces with their Necron servants, believing that this information would only make the Necrons more effective tools. The Star Gods never considered that the same understanding of physics and dimensional manipulation they provided could be turned against them. Zarek directed the Cryptex to study Catan vulnerabilities under the guise of developing more effective weapons for use against the Old One's remaining forces. The research proceeded slowly, conducted in isolated facilities where Catan attention rarely focused, with results carefully compartmentalized to prevent any single star god from recognizing the true purpose of the work. The Cryptex discovered that the Catan, despite their immense power, possessed specific weaknesses rooted in their nature as energy beings inhabiting physical vessels. The living metal bodies that contained them functioned as both prisons and sources of strength, concentrating their diffuse stellar consciousness into forms capable of interacting with the material universe at biological timescales. These vessels could be damaged through sustained application of force, though the Catan's ability to manipulate matter and energy made conventional weapons largely ineffective. The breakthrough came when researchers realized that the Catan's consciousness existed as patterns of energy distributed throughout their living metal forms, and those patterns could be disrupted through specific frequencies of electromagnetic radiation combined with gravitational distortions. The war scythes that would become the primary weapons against the Catan emerged from this research. These massive two-handed weapons incorporated phase shift generators that allowed their blades to exist partially outside normal spacetime, enabling them to cut through matter that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Cryptex enhanced the war scythes with harmonic resonators calibrated to frequencies that disrupted Catan energy patterns, effectively allowing the weapons to wound beings that conventional arms couldn't harm. Each war scythe required enormous power to operate, drawing from the same living metal technology that comprised Necron bodies, and making them practical only for the most powerful Necron nobles, who possessed the physical strength and energy reserves to wield them effectively. The most crucial discovery came from studying the nature of Catan consciousness itself. The Cryptex determined that the star gods weren't truly singular entities, but rather vast collections of energy patterns that had developed self-awareness over billions of years. These patterns maintained coherence through quantum entanglement and electromagnetic resonance across the entire volume of their living metal vessels. If that coherence could be disrupted sufficiently, the Catan wouldn't be destroyed, but rather shattered into fragments, each piece retaining a portion of the original consciousness and power, but lacking the unified will that made the complete entity so formidable. The realization suggested a strategy more practical than attempting to destroy beings who existed as pure energy. The Necrons could break the Khatan into manageable pieces that could then be contained and controlled. Zarek ordered the construction of tesseract labyrinths based on dimensional prison technology the Necrons had developed for containing particularly dangerous enemies. These devices created pocket dimensions with geometries that defied conventional physics, spaces that folded back on themselves in ways that made escape impossible for anything trapped within. The cryptex enhanced the labyrinth specifically to contain Khatan shards, incorporating stasis fields that would freeze the fragments in temporal suspension and prevent them from reconstituting into larger, more dangerous forms. The production of these containment devices proceeded under the cover of creating improved dimensional weapons for use against Old One strongholds, with the true purpose known only to the Silent King and the handful of cryptex directly involved in their construction. The coordination of the rebellion required Zarek to exploit the very programming that enslaved the Necrons to Khatan control. The biotransference safeguards prevented Necrons from acting directly against the star gods, but they didn't prevent actions that could be justified as serving Khatan interests, even if those actions ultimately led to rebellion. The Silent King issued orders positioning Necron forces to support what he described as a final offensive against the Old One's last strongholds, deployments that would require maximum Khatan involvement to succeed. He arranged for the star gods to disperse across multiple battlefields, separating them from each other in ways that appeared tactically necessary, but actually isolated each Khatan from potential support by their fellows. The timing of the rebellion synchronized with the final battles against the Old Ones, the moment when the ancient species' defeat appeared inevitable, and the Khatan's attention focused entirely on claiming victory and dividing the spoils. The Old Ones had been reduced to scattered remnants, their empire destroyed, and their created races either exterminated or driven into hiding. The Eldar survivors had fled into the webway, the Krork populations had been decimated, and the Old Ones themselves existed as desperate fugitives hunted across the galaxy. The Khatan gathered their power for what they believed would be the final extermination of their ancient enemies, positioning themselves on battlefields across dozens of star systems to personally oversee the destruction of the last Old One refuges. The rebellion began simultaneously across the entire Necron Empire, triggered by a command sequence Zarek had embedded in the deep programming of every Necron warrior. The signal bypassed the safeguards that prevented action against the Khatan by framing the attack not as rebellion, but as execution of a new priority directive. Millions of Necron warriors turned their weapons on the star gods they had served, Gauss flayers and particle casters opening fire on Khatan who had believed themselves immune to their servants' weapons. The initial volleys accomplished little against beings who could manipulate matter and energy with thought, but they served to distract the Khatan, while Necron nobles wielding warscythes closed for melee combat. The star gods reacted with shock that quickly transformed into rage as they recognized the rebellion for what it represented. Azagorod the Nightbringer unleashed waves of entropic energy that aged entire Necron formations into corroded ruins, his power over death and decay manifesting as temporal acceleration that reduced warriors to dust in seconds. Magladroth the Void Dragon reshaped the matter around him into weapons that tore through Necron ranks, his mastery of atomic bonds allowing him to transmute living metal into unstable isotopes that exploded with nuclear force. Mephitron the Deceiver created illusions that confused Necron targeting systems and made individual Khatan appear to be in multiple locations simultaneously, his manipulation of electromagnetic radiation rendering conventional attacks useless. The Necron assault succeeded not through superior power, but through overwhelming numbers and tactical coordination that exploited the Khatan's isolation from each other. Each star god faced millions of Necron warriors willing to sacrifice themselves to create openings for nobles wielding warscythes. The phase-shifted blades cut through Khatan defenses that had turned aside conventional weapons, their harmonic resonators disrupting the energy patterns that comprised the star god's consciousness. The Khatan discovered that their living metal bodies, which had given them physical form and power, also created vulnerabilities they had never possessed as diffuse stellar entities. The war scythes carved into those bodies, each strike disrupting portions of the quantum entanglement that maintained Khatan coherence. The shattering of the first Khatan occurred when concentrated war scythe strikes from multiple Necron nobles simultaneously disrupted critical nodes in the star god's energy matrix. The entity's consciousness, unable to maintain coherence across its entire form, fragmented into dozens of pieces. Each shard retained a portion of the original Khatan's power and awareness, but they lacked the unified will that had made the complete entity capable of reshaping reality. Necron forces immediately deployed Tesseract labyrinths, trapping the shards in dimensional prisons before they could attempt to reconstitute. The process repeated across multiple battlefields as Necron forces overwhelmed one Khatan after another through coordinated assault and immediate containment of the resulting fragments. Some star gods recognized the danger and attempted to flee, using their power over spacetime to escape the rebellious Necrons. The deceiver demonstrated particular skill at evasion, creating false images of itself, while the real Mephatron shifted through dimensions to avoid the warscythe-wielding nobles hunting it. Other Khatan fought with desperate fury, understanding that their servants had somehow overcome the programming that should have made rebellion impossible. The battles consumed entire star systems, as Khatan unleashed their full power against the Necron forces, stellar manipulation and gravitational distortions destroying worlds caught in the crossfire between gods and their rebellious creations. The Silent King personally led the assault on Azagorod, recognizing that the Nightbringer represented the most powerful and dangerous of the Khatan. Zarek wielded a warscythe enhanced beyond any other, its blade incorporating technology that had required centuries to develop and could only be powered by the Silent King's specially constructed body. The weapon cut through the Nightbringer's defenses with each strike, disrupting the energy patterns that gave the star god its terrifying power over death and entropy. The battle raged across a dead world, the Nightbringer's attacks aging portions of the planet's crust into dust, while Zarek's warscythe carved away pieces of the Khatan's living metal form. The contest ended when the Silent King's final strike severed the quantum connections, maintaining the Nightbringer's coherence, shattering the most feared of the star gods into fragments that Necron forces immediately imprisoned in Tesseract labyrinths. The rebellion's success depended on the speed with which Necron forces could shatter and contain each Khatan before the star gods could coordinate their response or attempt to restore their unity. The Necrons deployed Tesseract labyrinths by the thousands, each dimensional prison designed to hold a single Khatan shard in eternal stasis. The Cryptex had calculated that preventing the shards from ever reconstituting required not just physical separation, but dimensional isolation, trapping each fragment in a pocket universe where it existed alone without possibility of contact with other shards. The labyrinths served this purpose perfectly, their impossible geometries ensuring that anything trapped within them remained trapped forever unless deliberately released. The final Khatan to fall were those who had attempted to flee rather than fight. Necron forces pursued them across the galaxy, using the same Dolmen Gate technology the star gods had helped develop, tracking the fleeing Khatan through dimensional shifts and spatial distortions. The hunts lasted years in some cases, with entire dynasties dedicated to pursuing individual star gods across hundreds of star systems. The Deceiver proved particularly difficult to capture, its mastery of illusion and electromagnetic manipulation allowing it to evade Necron forces repeatedly. The eventual capture required elaborate traps that exploited Mephatron's arrogance, luring the Deceiver into situations where even its considerable powers couldn't prevent the warscythe strikes that shattered its coherence. The imprisonment of the Khatan shards in Tesseract labyrinths created a resource the Necron dynasties would exploit for millions of years. Each shard retained a portion of its parent Khatan's power and knowledge, making them valuable as both weapons and sources of energy. The dynasties claimed shards as spoils of war, with the most powerful fragments going to the pharaohs who had led the rebellion most effectively. Some dynasties incorporated Khatan shards into their war engines, using the imprisoned star gods to power weapons of devastating capability. Others studied the shards, attempting to extract knowledge about reality's fundamental forces that the Khatan possessed. The Tesseract labyrinths ensured the shards remained controllable, their power accessible, but their will suppressed by the dimensional prison's geometry. The Silent King claimed the largest and most powerful shards for his direct control, recognizing that these fragments represented both tremendous assets and potential threats if they ever escaped containment. Zarek ordered the construction of specialized vaults deep within tomb worlds, where the most dangerous shards could be stored under maximum security. The vaults incorporated multiple layers of dimensional barriers and stasis fields, with fail-safes designed to destroy the entire facility rather than allow a powerful shard to escape. The precautions reflected hard-won understanding of how dangerous even fragmented Khatan remained, their reduced state making them manageable but not harmless. The defeat of the Old Ones came not as a single decisive battle, but as the gradual collapse of a civilization that had dominated the galaxy for millions of years. The ancient species had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing through the webway, their empire shattered by the combined assault of the Necrons and the Khatan before the star god's own downfall. The few surviving Old Ones abandoned their installations and research facilities, taking with them only what they could carry through the webway portals, as Necron forces systematically destroyed everything they left behind. The biological masterworks that had been the Old Ones' greatest achievements burned under Necron weapons, entire ecosystems they had spent millennia cultivating reduced to lifeless ash. Worlds that had been terraformed with such precision that every organism played a role in perfectly balanced cycles now hosted only the dead, their atmospheres poisoned, and their surfaces scoured clean by weapons that operated on principles the Old Ones themselves had never fully understood. The hunting of the Old Ones through the webway consumed decades, as Necron forces pursued the fleeing remnants through dimensional tunnels that had once been the ancient species' greatest strategic advantage. The Dolmen Gates allowed Necron warriors to force entry into passages the Old Ones had believed secure, turning their transportation network into a trap where they could be cornered and killed. Small groups of Old Ones made desperate stands at webway junctions, using their psychic powers to collapse tunnels behind them and delay their pursuers. These rearguard actions bought time for other survivors to flee deeper into the network, but they couldn't prevent the inevitable. The Necrons advanced with mechanical patience, mapping the webway's structure and systematically eliminating every refuge the Old Ones attempted to establish. Some Old Ones escaped into regions of the webway so remote and labyrinthine that even the Necrons couldn't follow, disappearing into passages that connected to pocket dimensions or led to parts of the galaxy the ancient species had never fully explored. Others fled beyond the galaxy entirely, using webway tunnels that extended into the intergalactic void where they might find sanctuary among the stars of neighboring galaxies. The Necrons couldn't pursue them all, and the Silent King eventually ordered the hunts terminated when the cost of continuing exceeded any strategic benefit. The Old Ones who survived did so as refugees, their civilization destroyed and their power broken. They would never again shape the galaxy's evolution or guide the development of younger species. Their millions of years of dominance had ended with their transformation into hunted fugitives whose only achievement was survival. The galaxy the Necrons had inherited bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before the war in heaven began. Thousands of star systems had been sterilized during the conflict, their worlds reduced to airless rocks or molten spheres by weapons that had targeted entire solar systems. The celestial orreries had extinguished hundreds of stars, leaving vast regions of space dark and cold. Planets that had hosted thriving ecosystems for billions of years now drifted as frozen corpses through systems where the stellar radiation that had sustained life no longer existed. The Necrons' willingness to destroy stars to eliminate Old One strongholds had left permanent scars across the galaxy's structure, creating voids where vibrant star systems had once existed. The surviving species created by the Old Ones faced extinction or degradation without their creators' guidance and protection. The Eldar had retreated into the webway in sufficient numbers to ensure their species' survival, but they existed now as refugees occupying craftworlds and hidden settlements, rather than the thriving civilization the Old Ones had envisioned. Their psychic potential remained, but without Old One mentorship, they would need to develop their abilities through trial and error across thousands of years. The Krork populations had been decimated during the war, their numbers reduced from billions to scattered survivors who would eventually devolve into lesser forms as the genetic engineering that had created them degraded without Old One maintenance. Other species the Old Ones had created or modified simply went extinct, their populations too small to sustain themselves, or their specialized biology unable to adapt to environments that had been fundamentally altered by the war's devastation. The damage to reality itself represented perhaps the war's most catastrophic legacy. The weapons both sides had deployed hadn't simply destroyed physical matter, but had torn at the fabric of spacetime and the barriers between dimensions. The Khatan's manipulation of fundamental forces had created permanent distortions in local spacetime, regions where gravity behaved unpredictably or time flowed at rates that varied from moment to moment. The Old One's psychic abilities, deployed at scales that had reshaped entire star systems, had left the Imperium scarred and turbulent. The barrier between real space and the warp had been stressed beyond its normal tolerance, creating weak points where the two dimensions bled into each other in ways that defied natural law. These reality wounds attracted attention from entities that existed within the warp, predatory consciousnesses that had been drawn by the psychic emanations of the war and the souls of the countless beings who had died during the conflict. The enslavers emerged from the warp through the damaged barriers between dimensions, creatures of pure psychic energy that could possess living beings and use their bodies as anchors to maintain presence in real space. The enslavers had existed in the warp since its formation, but they had never before found the barrier between dimensions so thoroughly compromised. The psychic races the Old Ones had created, with their inherent connection to the Imperium, proved particularly vulnerable to enslaver possession. The enslaver plague began in isolated incidents that rapidly escalated into a galaxy-spanning catastrophe. Individual enslavers crossed through weak points in reality and possessed psychically sensitive beings, using their victims' bodies to create stable anchors that allowed more enslavers to manifest. Each possessed individual became a beacon that attracted additional enslavers, the psychic emanations of their invasion creating feedback loops that weakened the dimensional barriers further. Populations that included even small percentages of psychically sensitive individuals found themselves facing exponential growth in enslaver manifestations as the creatures spread through communities like a plague. The Eldar, with their potent psychic abilities and large populations concentrated in webway settlements, suffered catastrophically from enslaver attacks. The creatures manifested within craftworlds and hidden cities, possessing Eldar by the thousands and using their powerful psychic signatures to tear open larger breaches between dimensions. Entire craftworlds fell silent as their populations succumbed to possession, the Eldar's greatest strength becoming their fatal vulnerability. The survivors attempted to seal themselves away from the warp, but the enslavers could manifest anywhere the barrier between dimensions had been weakened by the war's damage. The Eldar population, which had numbered in the billions before the plague, contracted to a fraction of its previous size as communities across the galaxy fell to the psychic predators. The remaining Krork populations faced similar devastation despite their lesser psychic sensitivity. The enslavers found the Krork's distributed neural systems easier to possess than more centralized nervous systems, and the species' aggressive nature made possessed Krork particularly effective at spreading the plague to other populations. Krork strongholds that had survived the Necron assault fell to enslaver invasion as possessed warriors turned on their fellows and created the psychic disturbances that allowed more enslavers to manifest. The species that the Old Ones had designed as resilient shock troops discovered that their biological advantages meant nothing against enemies that attacked through dimensions they couldn't perceive or defend against. The Necrons observed the enslaver plagues spread with detachment born from their isolation from the warp. The creatures couldn't possess beings who lacked souls or psychic presence, making the Necrons immune to the threat that was consuming the galaxy's remaining biological populations. Necron forces encountered enslaver manifestations during their final campaigns against Old One remnants and simply destroyed the possessed individuals with their usual efficiency. The Gauss weapons that had proven so effective against biological enemies worked equally well against enslaver-possessed hosts, disassembling the physical anchors the creatures required to maintain presence in real space. The Necrons could walk through regions where reality had been damaged without fear of possession, their soulless nature providing absolute protection against threats that devastated species with psychic potential. The Silent King watched the enslaver plague consume the galaxy's remaining biological populations and understood the full scope of what the war in heaven had accomplished. The Necrons had defeated the Old Ones and shattered the Khatan, achieving victory in the conflict that had consumed their civilization for thousands of years. But that victory had cost them their souls and reduced most of their species to barely sentient automatons trapped in immortal bodies. The galaxy they had fought to conquer had been devastated beyond recognition, its thriving civilizations replaced by scattered survivors and vast regions of dead space where stars had been extinguished. The weapons both sides had deployed had damaged reality itself, creating conditions that allowed the enslaver plague to emerge and threaten the extinction of all remaining psychic species. The Necrons possessed military dominance over a galaxy that had become largely worthless. The worlds they might have colonized as biological beings held no value for mechanical warriors who required no atmosphere, water, or organic nutrients. The resources they might have exploited for industrial production meant little when their living metal bodies repaired themselves, and their weapons drew power from principles that didn't require conventional fuel sources. The Necrons had inherited a dying galaxy as soulless machines, their victory hollow because they had lost the capacity to appreciate or enjoy what they had won. They existed now as immortal consciousnesses trapped in mechanical bodies, their awareness preserved, but their ability to truly experience existence destroyed along with the souls the Khatan had consumed. The realization that their transformation had been an irreversible mistake spread through the Necron nobility as they surveyed the devastation and understood their own diminished state. The Pharaons who had retained enough consciousness to think beyond immediate tactical concerns recognized that biotransference had solved none of their fundamental problems, while creating new ones they had no means to address. They had escaped their genetic curse by abandoning biology entirely, but the immortality they had gained felt more like eternal imprisonment than liberation. The lower ranks existed in states barely distinguishable from the automated systems that maintained their tomb complexes, their consciousness reduced to such narrow parameters that calling them truly alive seemed generous. The Silent King convened the Triarch and the most powerful Pharaons to address the question of what the Necrons would do with their victory. Zarek presented the situation with the analytical clarity his transformed consciousness provided, describing the galaxy's current state and the Necrons' position within it. The empire they had built no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The dynasty worlds had been damaged or destroyed during the war, their populations transformed into mechanical warriors who required no cities or infrastructure. The Forge worlds that had produced weapons and ships sat silent, their purpose fulfilled and their output no longer necessary. The Necrons controlled vast territories, but those territories contained nothing they needed or wanted. The assembled Pharaons debated options that ranged from continuing military operations to pursuing research that might reverse biotransference. Some dynasties argued for hunting down the remaining Old Ones and Eldar populations, completing the extermination they had begun during the war. Others suggested focusing on containing or destroying the Khatan shards, ensuring the star gods could never reconstitute or escape their tesseract prisons. A few voices proposed attempting to restore their consciousness to biological form, though the cryptex reported that such restoration appeared impossible with their current understanding. The souls the Khatan had consumed were gone, and consciousness couldn't be transferred back into biological substrate without those essential components. The most radical proposal came from Zarek himself. The Silent King suggested that the Necrons enter a period of dormancy, retreating into stasis tombs where they would sleep for millions of years, while the galaxy recovered from the war in Heaven's devastation. The biological species that survived the Enslaver Plague would eventually rebuild civilizations, and new species would evolve to fill the ecological niches the war had emptied. When the Necrons eventually awakened, they would find a galaxy that had healed from the war's damage and repopulated with biological life. The Necrons could then pursue strategies to restore themselves to biological form, using the genetic material and knowledge available from those future civilizations, or they could simply reclaim their empire from species too primitive to resist. The proposal faced immediate opposition from dynasties that rejected the idea of surrendering their hard-won dominance. These pharaohs argued that entering dormancy would waste the advantages the Necrons currently possessed, that they should consolidate their control over the galaxy while they remain the dominant military force. The debates continued for years as different factions presented arguments for various courses of action. The discussions revealed the fundamental problem facing the Necrons. They had achieved military supremacy, but lacked any coherent purpose for that supremacy. They couldn't enjoy conquest as biological beings might, couldn't build civilizations that would provide satisfaction or meaning, couldn't even properly appreciate their own immortality, since their diminished consciousness made existence feel empty rather than eternal. The Enslaver Plague's intensification forced a decision before the Necrons reached consensus through debate. The dimensional barriers continued to weaken as more enslavers manifested and created additional breaches between real space and the warp. Entire regions of the galaxy became so saturated with enslaver presence that reality itself began breaking down, physical laws becoming inconsistent as the warp bled through into material space. The Necrons found themselves fighting not just against possessed biological beings, but against reality distortions that threatened to consume everything. The weapons that had won the war in heaven proved less effective against enemies that existed partially outside normal spacetime, and the Necrons lacked the psychic abilities necessary to properly combat creatures of pure warp energy. The Silent King recognized that the galaxy had become fundamentally hostile to biological life and would likely remain so for millions of years, while the dimensional damage healed and the enslaver populations exhausted their food supply. Zarek issued orders for the construction of tomb complexes on worlds across the galaxy, massive underground facilities where Necron forces could enter stasis and wait for conditions to improve. The tomb worlds would be designed to remain hidden and protected, their locations recorded in star charts that only the nobility would possess. Automated systems would monitor the galaxy's condition and trigger awakening protocols when the enslaver threat had passed, and new civilizations had emerged that might provide paths toward restoration. The Great Sleep began as Necron forces withdrew from active operations and retreated to their designated tomb worlds. Entire dynasties marched into the underground complexes and entered stasis chambers that would preserve their consciousness in suspension for millions of years. The pharaohs and overlords took their positions in specially prepared chambers where they would sleep but remain capable of limited awareness, able to monitor their tomb world's status and respond to threats that might emerge during their dormancy. The common warriors filled vast galleries by the millions, their simplified consciousness making the transition to stasis barely noticeable, since their awareness had already been reduced to near automation. The Silent King supervised the final preparations personally, ensuring that each tomb world had adequate defenses and that the awakening protocols would function correctly when triggered. Zarek visited the major dynasties to confirm their tomb complexes met specifications and their stasis systems would maintain integrity across geological timescales. The Silent King's own tomb complex, constructed on a world whose location he shared with no one, incorporated every defensive system and technological safeguard the cryptex could devise. Zarek would sleep longer than any other Necron, his awakening scheduled for a time when the galaxy had fully recovered and new civilizations had reached sufficient advancement to potentially offer solutions to the Necron's soulless existence. The last Necron forces entered stasis as the Enslaver Plague reached its peak intensity, the dimensional barriers so compromised that entire star systems had become uninhabitable for biological life. The galaxy fell silent as its dominant military power retreated underground and entered hibernation, leaving the surviving biological populations to face the enslavers without opposition. The Necrons had won the war in heaven, but inherited nothing except the knowledge that they had destroyed themselves as thoroughly as they had destroyed their enemies. They slept as soulless machines in a dying galaxy, their consciousness preserved, but their existence reduced to waiting for a future that might offer redemption, or might simply bring more centuries of meaningless immortality in bodies that could never truly live. The Silent King's final command echoed through the Necron Empire with the weight of absolute authority. Every dynasty would enter stasis within prepared tomb complexes, their consciousness suspended, while the galaxy healed from the catastrophic damage inflicted during the war in heaven. Zarek had calculated that millions of years would need to pass before conditions became suitable for the Necrons to pursue their ultimate goal, finding a way to reverse biotransference and restore themselves to biological existence. The galaxy needed time to recover from the Enslaver Plague, for new civilizations to emerge and develop the biological and technological sophistication that might provide solutions the Necrons themselves could not achieve. The Great Sleep represented not surrender but strategic patience, a willingness to wait eons for circumstances that might allow the Necrons to reclaim what the Khatan had stolen from them. The construction of tomb worlds proceeded according to specifications the cryptex had developed through years of careful planning. Each complex needed to protect its occupants across geological timescales, while remaining hidden from whatever species might eventually dominate the galaxy. The Necrons selected worlds based on multiple criteria: geological stability to ensure the tomb structures wouldn't be destroyed by tectonic activity, locations far from major stellar trade routes where future civilizations might establish colonies, and defensive positions that would allow awakened forces to secure their immediate surroundings before expanding operations. The tomb complexes extended kilometers beneath planetary surfaces, their corridors and chambers carved from living rock and reinforced with the same living metal that comprised Necron bodies. The tomb worlds incorporated multiple layers of defensive systems designed to protect sleeping Necrons from any threat that might emerge during their dormancy. Gauss pylons positioned at strategic points around each complex could activate automatically if sensors detected intruders, their molecular disassembly beams reducing unauthorized visitors to constituent atoms. Particle whips mounted on automated turrets provided additional coverage, their arcing energy capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. The entrances to tomb complexes featured dimensional barriers that would prevent physical access, while the main population slept energy fields that existed partially outside normal spacetime and couldn't be breached by conventional means. The canoptech constructs represented the most crucial component of tomb world defenses and maintenance. These autonomous machines operated on programming that didn't require conscious oversight, allowing them to function for millions of years without direction from sleeping Necron nobility. Canoptech wraiths phased through solid matter to patrol tomb corridors, their dimensional destabilization matrices allowing them to engage intruders who somehow penetrated outer defenses. Canoptech scarabs swarmed in clouds of thousands, their mandibles capable of stripping organic matter to bare bone in seconds, or consuming metal and stone to create raw materials for repairs. Canoptech spiders supervised the smaller constructs, their sophisticated programming allowing them to coordinate defensive responses and direct repair operations across entire tomb complexes. The stasis chambers themselves utilized technology that suspended Necron consciousness in a state between full awareness and complete shutdown. The process didn't simply freeze the occupant, but rather slowed their thought processes to rates where millions of years would pass as subjective moments. A Necron in stasis would experience the entire period of the Great Sleep as a brief interval, their consciousness preserved but not truly aware during the dormancy. The technology required precise calibration for each individual based on their level of consciousness retention after biotransference. Pharaons and overlords received chambers that maintained higher levels of awareness, allowing them to monitor their tomb world status through periodic partial awakenings that occurred every few thousand years. The common Necron warriors entered stasis in vast galleries that held millions of individuals in densely packed arrays. Their simplified consciousness made the distinction between active service and stasis suspension almost meaningless, their awareness already reduced to such narrow parameters that the transition barely registered. The warriors stood in perfect ranks within their chambers, Gauss flayers held at identical angles, their living metal bodies locked in positions they would maintain until awakening protocols triggered their reactivation. The galleries extended through multiple levels of each tomb complex, creating three-dimensional grids of dormant soldiers that represented the military might dynasties would deploy when they eventually emerged from the Great Sleep. The Tomb World protocols established hierarchical awakening procedures designed to prevent premature or uncontrolled emergence from stasis. The systems monitored multiple factors to determine when conditions warranted beginning reactivation sequences. Seismic sensors detected vibrations that might indicate activity on the surface above the tomb complex. Atmospheric samplers analyzed air composition to determine if the world had developed or retained a breathable atmosphere that would suggest biological colonization. Energy detectors scanned for electromagnetic signatures characteristic of advanced technology. The protocols evaluated all these inputs against thresholds the cryptex had established, triggering awakening only when multiple criteria indicated the galaxy had recovered sufficiently to make emergence worthwhile. The initial awakening would begin with canoptech constructs activating first, their systems coming online to assess the tomb complex's condition after millions of years of dormancy. The constructs would conduct repairs to any systems that had degraded during the long sleep, clearing collapsed passages and restoring power distribution networks. Once the canoptech swarms confirmed the tomb's integrity, the protocols would trigger partial awakening of the highest-ranking nobles, bringing pharaons and their immediate subordinates to consciousness while the bulk of the population remained in stasis. These nobles would evaluate the strategic situation, determine whether full awakening was warranted, and make decisions about how to proceed based on conditions they found. The varying success of tomb world preservation became apparent even before the Great Sleep fully commenced. Some complexes incorporated redundant systems and multiple backup protocols that would ensure their function across any conceivable timescale. These tomb worlds, typically belonging to the wealthiest and most powerful dynasties, had been constructed with resources that allowed every possible failure mode to be anticipated and countered. Other tomb complexes, built by dynasties with fewer resources or less sophisticated cryptech support, lacked such comprehensive safeguards. These tombs would prove vulnerable to geological events, equipment degradation, or simple bad luck that left their systems compromised after millions of years of operation. The dissolution of the unified Necron Empire occurred as the Silent King made his final decision before entering his own stasis. Zarek recognized that the biotransference had been his greatest mistake, that his determination to defeat the Old Ones had led him to accept the Khatan's offer without fully understanding its consequences. The Silent King had condemned his entire species to soulless existence in mechanical bodies, had reduced billions of individuals to barely sentient automatons, and had sacrificed everything that made the Necrontyr worth saving in exchange for military victory over enemies who no longer existed. The weight of this guilt drove Zarek to a decision that would shape the Necron's future. He would abdicate his authority and go into self-imposed exile, leaving the dynasties to awaken independently without central coordination. The Silent King's abdication dissolved the command structure that had unified the Necron military during the War in Heaven. The Triarch ceased to function as a governing body with Zarek's departure, and no mechanism existed to appoint a replacement Silent King without the consensus of dynasties that would spend millions of years in stasis. The Pharaons retained control over their individual dynasties, but the overarching imperial authority that had directed their combined forces against the Old Ones simply evaporated. Each dynasty would sleep in its tomb worlds and awaken according to its own protocols, with no coordination between different dynasties and no shared strategic vision for what they would do upon emergence. The preservation of dynastic rivalries during the Great Sleep ensured that awakened Necrons would resume the internal conflicts that had characterized their civilization before the War in Heaven. The political disputes, territorial claims, and personal grudges that had divided the dynasties remained encoded in the memories of sleeping pharaons and overlords. A dynasty that had contested border territories with a rival before entering stasis would remember those disputes upon awakening, their grievances preserved perfectly across millions of years by the stasis technology. The absence of the Silent King's authority meant nothing would prevent these old rivalries from reigniting when the dynasties emerged. No central power existed to arbitrate disputes or enforce cooperation between competing pharaons. The Silent King departed for the intergalactic void before the last tomb world sealed, his personal vessel carrying him beyond the galaxy's edge, where he would wander in isolation for millions of years. Zarek's exile served as self-imposed penance for his role in the biotransference, though it also removed him from the consequences of his decisions. The Silent King would not witness the varying fates of different tomb worlds, would not see which dynasties successfully preserved themselves, and which fell to equipment failure or geological catastrophe. He would travel through the darkness between galaxies, his consciousness active while his former subjects slept, contemplating the magnitude of his failure and searching for any possible path toward redemption. The slow awakening in the 41st millennium began with isolated incidents scattered across the galaxy. Tomb worlds triggered their emergence protocols in response to disturbances that met the criteria established millions of years earlier. Some awakenings occurred because geological surveys by younger races penetrated too deeply, their drilling and excavation equipment breaching tomb complex defenses and triggering automated responses. Other tomb worlds detected the energy signatures of orbital bombardments or fleet engagements in nearby space, interpreting these signatures as evidence that advanced civilizations had developed and warranted investigation. A few tomb worlds simply reached predetermined timers that initiated awakening regardless of external conditions, their protocols assuming that sufficient time had passed for the galaxy to have recovered. The awakened Necrons discovered a galaxy utterly transformed from the one they had left. The devastation of the War in Heaven had faded, replaced by thriving civilizations that had no knowledge of the ancient conflict or the species that had fought it. Humanity had risen to dominance through the Imperium of Man, a vast empire spanning millions of worlds and commanding military forces that numbered in the countless billions. The Eldar survived as scattered craftworld populations and hidden exodites, their empire destroyed by the birth of a chaos god, but their species enduring as shadows of what the Old Ones had created. The Orcs, devolved descendants of the Krork, spread across the galaxy as savage hordes that retained only dim echoes of their creators' sophistication. Dozens of other species had evolved or expanded during the Necrons' absence, filling ecological and strategic niches in a galaxy that had moved on without them. The younger races had built their civilizations on worlds the Necrons considered their territory, established colonies in star systems the ancient dynasties had claimed millions of years ago, and developed technologies that sometimes approached or even exceeded what the Necrontyr had achieved before biotransference. The awakened Pharaons studied these civilizations through sensors and scouts, analyzing their capabilities and vulnerabilities. Some dynasties saw the younger races as threats to be eliminated, inferior species that had trespassed on Necron territory during their long absence. Other Pharaons recognized potential in these biological civilizations, populations that might provide the genetic material and scientific knowledge necessary to pursue biotransference reversal. The harvest protocols emerged as different dynasties developed strategies for dealing with the younger races. Some pharaohs ordered the complete extermination of biological populations on worlds they claimed, viewing any non-Necron presence as unacceptable contamination of their territory. These dynasties deployed their awakened legions to sterilize planets, their Gauss weapons and particle casters reducing thriving colonies to lifeless wastelands within days. Other dynasties pursued more selective approaches, capturing biological specimens for study or preserving populations that might prove useful for future research. The variety of responses reflected the absence of central coordination, each dynasty pursuing its own agenda based on its pharaoh's personality and strategic assessment. The military capabilities awakened Necrons brought to bear shocked the younger races who encountered them. Imperial forces discovered that their weapons barely scratched living metal bodies that repaired damage automatically, that their tactics meant nothing against enemies who had fought wars spanning millions of years, that their numerical superiority couldn't overcome technological advantages the Necrons possessed. The Space Marines, humanity's elite warriors, found themselves facing opponents who matched their physical capabilities while exceeding their durability and tactical sophistication. The Imperial Guard's massed armies discovered that weight of numbers meant little when every Necron warrior could fight indefinitely without rest or resupply, when Gauss weapons could disassemble their tanks and fortifications at the molecular level. The incompleteness of many awakenings created situations where tomb worlds emerged from stasis with significant portions of their population still dormant or damaged beyond recovery. Equipment failures during the millions of years of sleep had corrupted stasis chambers, leaving some Necrons unable to fully reactivate or emerging with damaged consciousness that made them even less aware than their already diminished state. Canoptech constructs worked to repair these casualties, but the damage often proved irreversible. Some tomb worlds awakened with only fractions of their original populations functional, their military strength reduced by losses that had occurred while they slept helplessly in stasis. The rediscovery of Khatan shards in tomb world vaults presented awakened dynasties with weapons of terrible power and equally terrible risk. The Tesseract labyrinths had maintained their integrity across the millions of years, the imprisoned fragments of star gods still trapped in their dimensional prisons. Some pharaohs chose to deploy these shards as weapons, incorporating them into war engines, or releasing them under controlled conditions to devastate enemy positions. The Khatan fragments retained portions of their reality-manipulating abilities, making them devastatingly effective against younger races who had no experience fighting beings that could reshape matter and energy through will alone. Other dynasties kept their shards sealed, remembering too well how the complete Khatan had enslaved the Necrontyr and unwilling to risk even fragments of that power. The galaxy the Necrons inherited bore little resemblance to the one Zarek had envisioned when he ordered the Great Sleep. The millions of years had not healed the fundamental damage biotransference had inflicted on the Necron species. They remained soulless machines, their consciousness diminished and their existence hollow. The younger races they encountered possessed the biological vitality the Necrons had lost, but reversing biotransference proved as impossible in the 41st millennium as it had been when the Khatan first performed the transformation. The Necrons could harvest biological material, could study the genetics of younger species, could apply all their accumulated knowledge to the problem, but the souls the Khatan had consumed were gone forever, and consciousness couldn't be restored to biological form without those essential components. The awakened dynasties found themselves facing the same existential questions that had plagued the Silent King before his exile. They possessed military dominance over most opponents. They encountered, commanded technology that made them nearly invincible in conventional warfare, and controlled tomb worlds scattered across the entire galaxy. But they had no clear purpose for that power, no goal beyond reclaiming territory and eliminating threats to their continued existence. The Necrons had survived their long sleep only to discover that survival itself meant little when existence felt empty and meaningless, when their immortal consciousness experienced the universe through the dulled perception their mechanical bodies provided. The Great Sleep had preserved the Necrons across millions of years, but it had solved none of their fundamental problems. They remained trapped in bodies that could never truly live, their consciousness intact, but their capacity for genuine experience destroyed along with the souls the Khatan had devoured. The galaxy they awakened to offered conquest but not redemption, military victories but not restoration. The Necrons emerged from their tombs as the galaxy's oldest surviving civilization, ancient beyond the comprehension of the younger races they encountered, possessing knowledge and power accumulated across epochs. Yet all their advantages couldn't grant them what they truly sought, a way to become something more than the soulless machines they had been transformed into during their species' darkest hour, when desperation and the Silent King's terrible choice had condemned them to an immortality that felt more like eternal imprisonment than liberation.